and her team, please pass on a big thank you. They do an incredible job. Not only is it healthy, it's also tasty. And those two things don't always go together, but this is a good combination we have here. So, are we online, gentlemen? All right, we are online. Okay, so we'd like to give those of you who are joining us online a warm welcome as we start our Thursday afternoon at our Daniel 11 seminar here at Village Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's a privilege to be able to come and have these discussions, and we value the freedom that we enjoy in this nation to be able to discuss the scriptures, to be able to gather together, and to grow in our understanding. This morning we had two presentations by Dr. Tarsi Lee, really focusing on the translation of Daniel 11. And so this afternoon we have two presentations which come from competing in interpretive streams of Daniel 11. The first will be by Elder Kim Kier, who is a lifelong scholar of Scripture, and the second will be by Dr. Frank Hardy, who is a linguist with his doctorate in linguistics, and he is also a very keen student of the Hebrew language and of the book of Daniel in particular. And Dr. Frank Hardy would represent more the atheist interpretation of Daniel 11, and Elder Kim Kier, well, it's hard to actually pin him down, actually. But if you want to look at some of the previous presentations at previous conferences, he did a paper called Switching Hermeneutical Horses, which was the theological equivalent of a mugging in a backyard. It was brutal. And those who sat here who were not in agreement sat in shell shock as he delivered that Sabbath school presentation about 3 years ago, if I remember right. But he has a keen mind, and we're blessed by his presence with us today. He's going to be arguing today the case for the three powers in Daniel 11, verse 40. As you know, and in Uriah Smith's understanding, 11:40 has the king of the north, the king of the south, and the him, the third character there. And that forms the basis for his understanding of 11:40 forwards. So I would like to invite Elder Kier to come forward. He's going to share with us now, and as we do so, whether you're watching online or whether you're with us here this afternoon, I invite you to bow your heads and invite the Holy Spirit to bless this time together. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the gift of wisdom that you give to all who ask, not doubting that they shall receive. And we ask this afternoon, Father, that your Holy Spirit will fall upon Elder Kim Kier once again. Father, we thank you for the knowledge, the wisdom, the insight you've blessed him with. And Lord, as he shares with us today, I pray that you will speak through him. And I pray, Lord, that as we have these discussions, that greater truth will emerge and that you will guide us into greater unity as scholars and pastors and as evangelists. So, Father, we give this afternoon into your hands. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And you can download this presentation at daniel11prophecy.org. And at the 2023 conference, look for the drop-down menu for conference papers. It's up there, so you can follow it along at home if you wish.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, I need some glasses. Thank you for allowing me to be here and share with you the case for the three powers in Daniel 11 and verse 40. So whether two or three powers are present in Daniel 11:40 has been a subject of discussion for quite some time. Most of today's expositors predicate their understanding of two powers on the assumption that the king of the north has been the dominant figure for much of the chapter. The king of verse 36 is assumed to be the king of the north, who is attacked by the king of the south in verse 40, and therefore no third participant is plausible. However, if it can be shown that the king of the north is not the king of verse 36, then a third participant is demanded. Dr. Tarsi Lee, in his 2021 paper, uses Direct's rules, I hope I'm pronouncing that well enough, in an attempt to identify anaphoric references within the text of Daniel 11. While he concluded that these rules were consistent and useful in clarifying at least some of the anaphoric ambiguities in the text, they were insufficient in solving or for solving the anaphoric references that span longer stretches of text. Yet, some give the King of the North mentioned in verse 15 such prophetic significance that the King of the North remains the major player from verse 15 onward. This is an assumption that greatly influences the identification of the King of the North in verse 40. However, Direct's rule appears at this time to be insufficient for solving the anaphoric ambiguities that span the 24 verses between the final reference to the King of the North in verse 40 and the previously mentioned King of the North in verse 15. A different method of ascertaining the identity of the antecedent of him in verse 40, and thereby whether there are 2 or 3 powers involved in that verse, seems appropriate. From the first mention of the interaction between the King of the South and the King of the North in the 10 verses from verse 6 through verse 15, either one or both are explicitly cited 8 times. This back and forth engagement between the King of the North and the King of the South in verses 6 through 15 is closely monitored by Gabriel, who mentions them by name in 80% of the verses. However, following chapter 11, verse 15, and prior to verse 40, the King of the South is mentioned only twice in verse 25, while the King of the North is not mentioned at all. Gabriel's references to these kings crash from 80% to 8% of the verses. Gabriel has ceased any discussion of them as dominant kings. Why? Who is the king that Gabriel references after verse 15 for the next 24 verses? The interpretive narration of Daniel 8:23 tells us that the 4 directionally labeled Greek kings are coming to their end. While the Greek horns are waning in power, another distinct horn, not given a directional label, rises to power in Daniel 8:24. We would expect Gabriel's narration of chapter 11 to follow the same outline of interpretation as chapter 8, albeit in a more detailed narrative. To ascertain then whether or not Rome is the King of the North, we must necessarily return to verses 13 and 14. The study of these verses will help us determine if the King of the North moniker is being transferred from one power to another, and whether the king of verse 16 is the same or at least has similar roots as the King of the North mentioned in verse 40. Most of us agree that Daniel chapter 11 and verse 13 is discussing the return of Antiochus III to retake the territory he lost to Ptolemy, Coal Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, approximately 14 years earlier. Ptolemy IV Philopator has just died and left his 5-year-old son Ptolemy V Epiphanes as the new ruler. Antiochus III sees the takeover opportunity and enters into an alliance with King Philip, king of Macedon, to divide the spoils between them in a war with Ptolemy V. Verse 14 is somewhat parenthetical to the narration of the upcoming war between the King of the North and the King of the South. In those times, or during the preparations by Antiochus and Philip to attack Ptolemy, there are many who stand up against the King of the South. These include Agathocles, Agathoclea, and Sosibius, who plotted to plunder the treasury and place Agathocles on the throne, or to at least make him the regent for Ptolemy. The Aetolian general Scopas similarly plotted to seize the kingdom for himself. The next phrase in the verse begins with also. In addition to the various plots against Ptolemy V Epiphanes, also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Also indicates in addition to. That is, someone or some group other than the many seeking the overthrow of the king of the south. This phrase is pivotal to the discussion of who the king of the north is. The NSAB, the NIV, the ESV, and Dr. Lee translate robbers of thy people as violent ones among your people, or a variation of the same. While the King James Version, Young's literal translation, Wycliffe's translation use robbers of thy people. The renderings, respectively, suggest a faction of Daniel's people or a power against Daniel's people. What's the best way to decide how to interpret this phrase? As even Dr. Lee this morning said, both of them could work. What's the best way to decide how to interpret this phrase? As it appears, it can be translated in more than one way. Should the phrase be translated robbers of thy people or violent ones among your people? The words used in conjunction with this phrase will help us determining the best way to translate it. Either the robbers or violent ones seek to establish or fulfill the vision. The question arises, what vision? The word chazon, translated vision in verse 14, appears only once in chapter 11. So what vision is Gabriel referring to, since no symbolic vision is shown to Daniel in chapter 11? The identity of the vision is important because the events connected with the robbers or the violent ones will establish the vision. If Gabriel is referencing a vision unknown to Daniel, if Daniel has never seen the vision Gabriel is referring to, it makes no sense for Gabriel to make the point that the robbers or violent ones are going to establish that vision. Daniel would be confused by not knowing what vision Gabriel is referring to, and we would never be able to confirm Gabriel's critical point that the robbers or violent ones would establish the vision. Yet, we are not given enough information in verse 14 to identify the vision to which Gabriel refers. To understand what vision Gabriel is referring to, we must look at his previous references to the vision found in chapter 10. In chapter 10, verse 14, Gabriel refers to Hazon. The appearance of Gabriel and Christ in chapter 10 comes in answer to the fasting and prayer of Daniel. He understands the vision is long, but continues to pray for further light. This is the only usage of Hazon in Daniel 10. Gabriel informs Daniel of the purpose for his visit. It is to make Daniel understand the Hazon, which concerns the fate of Daniel's people in the last days. Gabriel's explanation of the vision is his chapter 11 narration. The language of Daniel chapter 10, verse 14 tells us that Daniel is already familiar with the Hazon, yet does not fully understand it. Again, the question is asked, what vision is Gabriel coming to make Daniel understand when there's no symbolic vision given in that chapter 10 or chapter 11? The vision is further described as for many days. This brings us back to the last vision given to Daniel, the one in chapter 8. The vision of chapter 8 is the only vision referred to as Hazon. It's also the vision that was for many days. In chapter 9, Gabriel, whom Daniel has seen in the vision at the beginning, which refers back to chapter 8, appears to Daniel in answer to his prayer. He is there to give him skill and understanding about the chapter 8 vision. But Gabriel only gives Daniel a partial explanation. Ellen White states this in Sanctified Life, page 49. Upon the occasion just described, the angel Gabriel imparted to Daniel all the instruction which he was then able to receive. The occasion just described was the appearance of Gabriel in Daniel chapter 9. Ellen White had quoted Daniel 9:2-4 and Daniel 9:15-19 when describing Gabriel's visit. In that visit, Gabriel imparted to Daniel all the instruction which he was then able to receive. Gabriel was only able to describe the events that would take place under the 70-week portion of the prophecy. In answer to Daniel's further inquiries, Gabriel and Christ return in chapter 10 to reveal further light concerning what would happen in the latter days. A few years afterward, however, the prophet desired to learn more of the subjects not yet fully explained, and again set himself to seek light and wisdom from God. And then she quotes Daniel 10:2-6. Our Lord comes with another heavenly messenger to teach Daniel what would take place in the latter days. And in response to his supplications, light from the heavenly courts was communicated for those who live in the latter days. Gabriel's use of the word Hazon in chapter 10 and 11 refer back to the Hazon of chapter 8. It can be no other. It's the only vision in the entire book of Daniel referred to with the use of Hazon. Thus, the Hazon of chapter 10, verse 14, and of chapter 11, verse 14, is the vision of chapter 8. Consequently, either the robbers of thy people or the violent ones among thy people are going to exalt themselves to establish the chapter 8 vision. As we look back at the chapter 8 vision, where do we find the violent ones among thy people mentioned? They have a decisive role in Gabriel's interpretation, that is, to establish or fulfill the vision. Surely then, they'd be mentioned somewhere in the vision itself. If we find no reference to the violent ones among thy people within the vision proper, how could we know when or how they exalted themselves to establish or fulfill that vision? Gabriel would be sending us into a prophetic dead end by mentioning a fulfillment that could never be substantiated. I find nowhere in the vision proper where the violent ones among thy people are mentioned, much less the mention of them exalting themselves. In fact, nowhere in any of the prophetic portions of the book of Daniel can any group be labeled violent ones among thy people. Rather than finding violence committed by the violent among Daniel's people, we find violence committed against Daniel's people in chapter 8. Indeed, throughout the book of Daniel, both by precept in Daniel 7 and 8 and 9, and by example in Daniel 1, 2, 3, and 6, violence is committed against rather than by Daniel's people. The translation, violent ones among thy people, doesn't fit well with the overall context of the primary reason for mentioning them, which is the fulfillment of the vision. We turn now to the robbers of thy people. According to the Gesenius's Hebrew Chaldee lexicon, the word translated robber in Daniel 11:14 means a breaker, something that rends abroad, as a wild beast in Isaiah 35:9, or a violent man. Are the robbers or breakers of Daniel's people mentioned anywhere within the vision proper that would allow us to understand their actions as fulfilling the interpretation of Gabriel? Yes, the little horn is said to stamp on the hosts and stars and destroy the mighty and the holy people. It is the little horn that brings violence to Daniel's people. The little horn casts them down, stamps upon them, and destroys them. It is the little horn in Daniel chapter 8 that does violence to Daniel's people. The little horn is also a robber of Daniel's people. The word translated robbers in Daniel 11:14 is translated the same way in Ezekiel chapter 7. The passage in Ezekiel 7 refers to the coming of Babylon to Jerusalem to destroy it. They entered the temple at Jerusalem and they robbed it. The little horn did the same in 70 AD. He entered into the temple and defiled it. The Ark of Titus in Rome depicts the temple furniture stolen by the Romans as the spoils of the destruction of Jerusalem. To this day, Israel continues to ask Rome to return the stolen goods. In the vision, the little horn, or Rome, rises to power at the time when the 4 divisions of Greece are coming to their end. This is how the robbers of thy people exalt themselves to establish the vision. It's at the time when the Greek horns are filling up their cup at the latter end of their kingdom that another power is introduced. It is not the one of the directionally labeled Greek horns, for those horns are coming to their end. It is a 5th horn rising in a new location, a new power altogether. Seventh-day Adventists see this 5th horn as Rome, simply referred to as the king of fierce countenance, without any assigned directional label. It is significant to note that when the reigning kingdom's transgressions come to the full, another kingdom generally stands up. From the point when another kingdom is introduced, any further events in the previous kingdom are generally glossed over or not mentioned. We see this in the transition from the Medo-Persian to the Grecian kingdom in Daniel 11:2 and 3. Once Alexander's Grecian kingdom is introduced, the remaining kings of the Persian Empire are not discussed. Thus, when Rome, the king of fierce countenance, is introduced, events focus on him as the principal player in the narrative. As a result of Rome's rise, when the 4 Greek horns are coming to their end, we see no indications in either chapter 8 or chapter 11 that Rome assumes the title King of the North. Building on the introduction of Rome at the latter time of the divisions of the Alexandrian kingdom in chapter 8, Gabriel in chapter 11 relates in more detail the events surrounding the rise of a king of fierce countenance, the very events that will fulfill the vision. At the time Philip of Macedon and Antiochus III are plotting to overthrow Egypt, when many are standing up against the king of the south, Rome, the robbers and breakers of Daniel's people would stand up. The word translated establish in Daniel 11:14 is the same root word as stand up, used previously in that verse. The term stand up is used throughout Daniel to refer to a king or kingdom assuming or gaining ruling power or losing power if they fail to stand. The robbers of thy people would lift themselves up, would stand up, and by doing so would fulfill the vision. Rome is the final power to rise in the vision of chapter 8. Rome then becomes the focus of chapter 8 until it is broken without hand. Its rise, says Gabriel in chapter 11, establishes the vision. These identifying characteristics cannot be successfully applied to the violent ones among your people, who are mentioned nowhere in the vision of chapter 8. They did not stand up to begin any kind of rule, nor can it be shown that they exalted themselves to fulfill the chapter 8 vision. Historically, in those times, Rome is rising to power. They are fresh off the victory over Hannibal. They have decisively defeated Philip V in the Second Macedonian War. While Rome is involved with Philip V, Antiochus sees his opportunity to strike Egypt. After describing the many that stand up against the king of the north in verse 14, along with the introduction of Rome, Gabriel continues with the outcome of the struggle between the north and the south. So the king of the north shall come. So indicates the continuation of the anticipated war described in verse 13. The king of the north coming against the king of the south. Verse 13 announces the event, while verse 15 relates the outcome. Antiochus III is victorious and takes whole Syria and Palestine back from Egypt. He casts up a mount by laying siege to Scopus at Sidon, where Scopus is holed up with 10,000 men. Several Egyptian generals try to free Scopus but are unable to do so. Scopus is forced by famine to surrender. Antiochus takes several other fenced cities, including Batanea, Samaria, Abila, and Gadara. Ptolemy is defeated. For all their attempts, the arms of the south are unable to withstand. A peace ensues, and Antiochus III betroths his daughter Cleopatra I to Ptolemy V in 195 BC. They are then married in 194-193 BC. Now, let's look at verse 16. In Dr. Lee's translation, he notes that the he, or the one, as he translated, is an anaphoric reference to the king of the north or his successor descendant, and the him reflects an anaphoric reference to the king of the south. It appears that he does not cite any of Direct's rules for his conclusion. And this is a pivotal position that he carries through the rest of the chapter, noting each new king that stands up as the king of the north. However, verse 16 begins with the word but. The American Standard Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, and the Revised Standard Version, among others, all begin verse 16 with but, as does the King James. Even though Antiochus III defeats Egypt in verse 15 and takes back the territories that have been disputed for over 100 years, his victory is short-lived. But he will come against him. Him cannot be referring to the king of the south, for the king of the south was already defeated in verse 15 and hasn't any strength to withstand. There's no point in coming against a strengthless, defeated foe a second time, especially one that you just made a peace treaty with. Once you've knocked out your opponent, there's no need to hit him again. The use of the word but at the beginning of the verse denotes a change, a reversal, rather than a continuation. We would not say, the king of the north defeats the king of the south in verse 15, but in verse 16, the king of the north defeats the king of the south. It's a pointless redundancy. What we would say is the king of the north defeats the king of the south, but he, another power, defeats the king of the north. The hymn of verse 15 refers back to the king of the north, Antiochus III Epiphanes, just Antiochus III, the principal victorious party of verse 15. Notwithstanding his recent victory, someone will come against him. Now, we have three powers. The king of the north, the king of the south, just defeated, the king of the north, just victorious, and someone who will come against him, against the one left standing, against the victor of the verse 15 conflict. Well, who is this third party involved in the affairs of the king of the north and the king of the south? Who came against Antiochus III shortly after his victory over Ptolemy V? Historically, it's the same power introduced in verse 14 as the robbers of Daniel's people. He, Rome, comes against him, Antiochus III, and defeats him decisively in the final battle of the Roman Seleucid War at Magnesia in 190 BC. According to Polybius, God raised up the Romans to punish Philip and Antiochus for their attempt to overthrow the young Ptolemy V Epiphanes. In less than a decade, Rome has defeated Macedonia and the Seleucid Empire. Rome is now the superpower in the Middle East. It takes some years, but Rome annexes Egypt and takes over much of the area the Seleucids once occupied. Being the superpower, Rome does according to his own will, and none shall stand against him. Only the major powers spoken of in Daniel are described as doing according to their own will. The Medo-Persian Ram did according to his own will in Daniel 8:4. Alexander's Greece would do according to his will in Daniel 11:3. But his successors, including the king of the north, would not reach his level of power. Thus, Daniel cannot be referring to Antiochus III in verse 16. Antiochus did not do according to his will. He was subject to Rome. Neither could he defeat all enemies, for Rome stood against him and prevailed. The terms of peace after Magnesia forced Antiochus III to pay 15,000 talents over a period of 12 years, surrender his elephants and his fleet, and further furnish hostages, including his son Antiochus IV. His kingdom was now reduced to Syria, Mesopotamia, and western Iran. In 187, Antiochus was murdered in a Baal temple near Susa, where he was exacting tribute in order to obtain much-needed revenue. After the death of Antiochus III, his sons, Seleucus IV Philopater and Antiochus IV Epiphanes, continued to pay off the debt. It is the conquered who pay tribute to the conqueror. And although Antiochus did stand in Israel, Gabriel states that the one who stands in the glorious land consumes it by his own hand. This Antiochus did not do, but rather he benefited the Jews. Now these testimonials, which I, Josephus, have produced, are sufficient to declare the friendship which Antiochus the Great bare to the Jews. By 198 BCE, the Jews of Palestine had become disenchanted with the Ptolemaic rule, and they opened the gates of Jerusalem to Antiochus and insisted in the expulsion of its Egyptian garrison. Antiochus rewarded the Jews for their splendid reception by restoring those parts of Jerusalem destroyed by the war, freeing its citizens from taxes for 3 years, and supplying funds for the temple, and in general by permitting members of the nation to have a form of government in accordance with the laws of the country. This is not the description of a consuming ruler. Rome, on the other hand, did do according to his own will. No one could stand against him. In the vision, the power of the ram, or Medo-Persia, is exceeded by that of the goat, or Greece, which is, in turn, exceeded by the little horn, or Rome. The little horn, Rome, expands towards the south. That's the king of the south. Toward the east, the Seleucid Empire, the king of the north. And toward the pleasant land, or Israel. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 9. These are the very nations Rome conquered, described in historical, chronological order by Gabriel's Daniel 11 interpretation. The interpretation of Daniel 11 dovetails precisely with the vision of chapter 8. Rome is introduced by Gabriel in verse 14 as the robbers of thy people, and in verse 16, Gabriel's words foretell the robbers consuming the land of Daniel's people. Rome becomes the dominant power in the chapter after conquering Antiochus III, the king of the north. But Rome is not the king of the north. Rome conquers the king of the north. Now, some might argue that since Rome did conquer the king of the north, that somehow by this act it takes the title king of the north. Should it be considered an interpretive principle that when a nation conquers another nation, it assumes its title? If it's an interpretive principle, did Rome also assume the title king of Israel for consuming that nation? Did Rome assume the title king of the south when it conquered Egypt? And what happened when the Ottoman Turks conquered the area once occupied by the Seleucids? Did the Ottoman Turks, as conquerors, assume the title king of the north? If the Seleucids lost the title king of the north when conquered by Rome, would not Rome in turn lose its claim to the same title when it was conquered? If it's an interpretive principle, then it must be applied consistently, not arbitrarily. There is, of course, no intimation in the chapter 8 vision that when the 4 Alexandrian horns, one of which is the king of the north, come to their end, that Rome, designated by Gabriel as the king of fierce countenance, assumes the title king of the north. Nor is there any intimation by Gabriel in chapter 11 that Rome assumes the title king of the north. Rome has conquered the king of the north, but is simply referred to from verse 16 forward as he or him. Gabriel had informed Daniel that he would declare the truth of the vision's symbols. He defined for Daniel who the king of the north was, a ruler of part of Alexandrian's Grecian world empire. Following the defeat of Antiochus III, the king of the north is not mentioned again for the next 24 verses until verse 40, with no indication that there's been any transference of the title. It is conspicuously absent. Gabriel, in his narrative from this point until verse 40, relates events in the history of both pagan and papal Rome, yet when referring to Rome, never once uses the phrase king of the north. The end of verse 16 now places us at least as late as 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey stands in the glorious land. We must then find fulfillments from verse 17 onward from that historical time frame, rather than the history of Antiochus III, who is long since dead. He, Rome, the victor of verse 16, the one who does according to his own will and stands in the glorious land, will also, in addition, set his face to enter by force the whole kingdom. Also here denotes a continuation of the exploits of the one before whom no one can stand. Bishop Thomas Newton, in his dissertations on the prophecies, suggests he shall also set his face to enter by force the whole kingdom. Rome, having conquered the Seleucids and stood in the glorious land, for the next few verses engages Egypt, the remainder of the whole kingdom once held by Alexander the Great. With the death of Ptolemy Auletes, Rome accepts the guardianship of 2 of his children, Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra the 7th, initially under the jurisdiction of Pompey. Cleopatra and her brother ruled jointly for a time, but a falling out between them leads to civil war. Julius Caesar arrives in Egypt in pursuit of Pompey, but finds Pompey assassinated by the courtiers of Ptolemy the 13th. Caesar summons Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII and commands them to disband their armies and rule together. Well, this incenses the Egyptians, who declare war on Caesar. Caesar summons all of his allies in the neighboring countries to come to his assistance. Antipater, with an army of Jewish soldiers, the upright ones in the verse, are instrumental in saving Caesar from defeat. Shortly after the arrival of reinforcements, Ptolemy XIII drowns in battle, and Caesar declares Cleopatra and her 12-year-old brother Ptolemy XIV co-rulers, while carrying on an affair with Cleopatra. Caesar, in effect, sets up Cleopatra as the sole ruler of Egypt, and that Cleopatra was morally corrupt, history attests. Yet it is suggested by some within and without the church that Cleopatra VII could not be the daughter of women because she was a southern Ptolemaic princess, and therefore could not be given by the king of the north in political marriage to the king of the south. Now, this suggestion is offered that the daughter of women was Cleopatra I, the daughter of the king of the north, Antiochus III, given in political marriage to Ptolemy V. Well, this assumes that Antiochus III, king of the north, is still very much in control, when in actuality the Seleucid Empire has been subjugated by Rome in the previous verse. Antiochus III did not make any meaningful political alliances after being conquered by Rome, but was desperately trying to pay off the tremendous debt imposed on him by the Romans. Nor did the political marriage of Cleopatra to Ptolemy V morally corrupt her. In addition, we are well down the historical timeline. Antiochus III has been dead for over 100 years by the time Rome stands in the glorious land. Nor does the word translated give in verse 17 require a political marriage. Give has a wide variety of meanings, including to grant, to permit, to appoint, to set or set over, to put or to place, and is used in Daniel some 17 times. In Daniel 1, 8, and 11, it's used to mean placed in one's control. In Daniel 11, 6, it's given up, likewise referring to, or likely referring to the death of Berenice at the hands of Laodice. In Daniel 11:31 and 12:11, it's set up or placed. There is nothing in "he shall give him the daughter of women" that demands we understand it as a political marriage. Rather, upon the death of Ptolemy XIII, Caesar in effect gives or sets up Cleopatra VII as the queen of Egypt. With this, the historian concurs. According to Plutarch, after the death of Ptolemy XIII, thereupon Caesar made Cleopatra, his sister, queen of Egypt. Likewise, Edwin Bevan writes in his A History of Egypt under the Ptolemaic Dynasty, Caesar returned to Alexandria, master of the situation. Although Cleopatra was now hated by her subjects, at any rate by the Greeks and Macedonians of Egypt, because she had given herself to the Roman, they had to see her established as queen by the invincible Caesar. After Caesar is assassinated, Cleopatra VII has her brother Ptolemy XIV assassinated, and her sovereignty is no longer contested. Cleopatra, though indebted to Rome by her position, or for her position as Queen of Egypt, turns on and wars against Rome. She will not be for Rome, and she will be defeated. Cleopatra VII had a tremendous effect on the policy of Rome, influencing the formation of the Roman Empire. She was the ruler that presided over the fall of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt that brought to an end the Hellenistic period. Verse 16 and 17 are actions initiated by Rome not Antiochus III, the king of the north, who has again been dead for over 100 years. There's no indications from the text itself that the king of the north is now the title of Rome. Verse 18 and 19 outline the conquest of Caesar as he returns to Rome and is there assassinated by the senators in the theater of Pompey. Historians conclude that the death of Caesar brings the Roman Republic to an end. Verse 20 outlines the beginning of the Roman Empire. Octavian, known as Caesar Augustus, is the adopted son of Julius Caesar and stands up in his estate. He brings Rome to the pinnacle of power and establishes the Pax Romana that lasts for roughly 200 years. Augustus was the ruler that presided over the fall of Egypt and brought to an end the divisions of the Grecian Empire. He was a raiser of taxes who sent Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. This taxing, according to the Gospel of Luke, was a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. It was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria rather than at the beginning of the reign of Augustus. This places the taxation at the time of Christ's birth, well into the reign of Augustus. He has at most 17 years left in his life after this decree. These years are a few days when compared to the vision's many days of 2,300 years. Augustus died a natural death, neither in anger nor in battle, which can't be said of his predecessors, Julius Caesar and Pompey, or of Antiochus or any of his sons. Or either of his two sons, anyway, Seleucus Philopator and Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel 8:9, where the little horn waxes great towards the south, the east, and the pleasant land. And Daniel 8, verse 23, where the king of fierce countenance stands up as the Alexandrian horns are coming to their end, are now fulfilled. The vision has been established. Rome stands up at the latter end of their kingdom and now rules the Hellenistic territory according to his own will, and none are able to stand against him. Gabriel has introduced us to three main players: the king of the north, the king of the south, and Rome, along with the ramifications for Daniel's people. And these are the three main players that will resurface in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. With the death of Augustus, Tiberius, his adoptive son, stands up in his estate. Tiberius did not obtain the kingdom by conquest. He came in peaceably. He was flattered into taking the role as leader. According to the Annals of Tacitus, the senators whose sole fear was to seem to understand him burst into tears, plaints, and vows. With extended arms, they supplicated the gods, invoked the image of Augustus, and embraced the knees of Tiberius, the Senate stooping to the most humiliating importunity. Tiberius finally acquiesced. Yet Tiberius, a vile, morally corrupt person, was very unpopular with the people. While other rulers were accorded great honors in their death, even to the point of deification, the death of Tiberius filled the streets with jubilation. Suetonius writes, "The first news of his death caused such joy at Rome that people ran about yelling, 'To the Tiber with Tiberius!' And others offered prayers to Mother Earth and the infernal gods to give him no home below except among the damned." There were also loud threats to drag his body off with a hook and fling it on the stairs of mourning. For popular resentment against this savage behavior was now increased by a fresh outrage. Thus, the hatred of Tiberius grew hotter than ever. His cruelty, it is said, continued even after his death. And when the funeral procession left Misenum, the cry went up, "Take him to the amphitheater at Atella. Give him only a half-burning." For Atella was the home of popular farces, and half-burning in an amphitheater would have been a farcical ignominy. Tiberius was not given the honor of the kingdom as Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus were. This brings us to the death of Christ in the next verse. Gabriel has cited the kings in power at the birth, ministry, and death of Jesus Christ. However, Gabriel has not intimated in the least that Rome is the king of the north. Rome has simply been referred to as he since verse 16, and continues to be thus referred to for the next several verses. Verse 35 brings us to the time of the end, with verse 40 beginning to relate the events that will take place during the time of the end. In verse 36, Gabriel identifies the king that will play a major role in those events, sandwiched between verses 35 and 40. He spends 4 verses, 9% of the chapter, describing this king so we can accurately know who is going to play such an outsized role in the final events leading down to the close of probation and the second coming. Yet, there's no attempt to give this king any directional label for a title. He is simply referred to as the king. This king would do according to his will, a phrase reserved only for the dominant powers in the vision. The descriptive phrases of this king are the same as found referring to the little horn of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 appears to quote directly from Daniel 11:36 and 37 when he refers to the man of sin. If Rome is the king referred to in verse 36 through verse 39, and if Rome is the king of the north, why not mention it in those verses? There's been an unusually long interlude since the last mention of the title King of the North. Gabriel uses extensive detail in delineating his identifying characteristics. Again, 9% of the chapter. And given the prominent role he will play in the final events of the chapter, why is there no definite declaration that the king of verse 36 to verse 39 is indeed the king of the north? Not declaring that this powerful king is the king of the north reinforces the idea that he is not the king of the north. The king of verse 36 is the first him mentioned in verse 40, who is attacked by the king of the south, and in turn by the king of the north. Unless it can be conclusively demonstrated that following verse 15 of Dr. Lee's translation, unless it can be conclusively demonstrated that following verse 15 of Dr. Lee's translation, the designation of King of the North has passed to Rome, that Rome can never lose the title King of the North, and that the king of verse 36 is the king of the north, then the first hymn of verse 40, not having been designated as the king of the north, is a third distinct power, distinct from the king of the north and the king of the south. In verse 40, the 3 powers evident from verses 16 and 17 are once again brought together. Finally, I'd like to cite Dr. Richard Litke from his unpublished The Other Side of Daniel, where he describes 3 powers in verse 40. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Dr. Litke, he taught Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic at Walla Walla University as a full-time, part-time, and contract professor for 60 years. He earned his PhD in ancient languages from Yale University and was fluent in 7 languages, including Mandarin Chinese and 3 separate Greek dialects. Dr. Litke writes, in Daniel 11:40, there exist 2 significant but parallel clauses which are rendered in the New King James Version as, the king of the south will attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him. The construction in the Hebrew Bible here portrays two distinctly separate powers represented in typical Hebrew syntactical style in a parallel construction as struggling in a hostile action with the same singular object of their fury. In each clause, an action verb is followed by an antagonistic preposition to which a pronominal suffix is attached, literally imo, with him, and ale, I don't know how to pronounce that, I don't speak Hebrew, against him. In this syntactical arrangement, a person who is familiar with Hebrew syntax would immediately perceive here the existence of such an obviously parallel idea and construction that it would tend to eliminate any idea of a reciprocal action as being pictured in these two verbs against supposed plural prepositional objects. Hence, here, there is only one single object in spite of the two verbs. The prepositional object of all this verbal activity is clearly to be found in the topical subject introduced much earlier in 1136, the king, the one who is the focus of all the activity in verses 36 to 39. One cannot just here obtain the idea in 1140 that the king of the south and the king of the north are somehow attacking each other. They are here represented instead as both attacking a common enemy who is simply represented as him in each of the two clauses. Thus, the first clause itself pictures an attack against some previously mentioned antecedent with him, and it is thus anaphoric in its general sense rather than reciprocal or cataphoric in force. And the clause should therefore not be construed either syntactically or exegetically as representing a reciprocal attack against each other or against someone who is to be mentioned in the following part of the verse. In brief, then, the pronominal suffix at the end of each of the two prepositional phrases in 1140 must refer to one single entity that is utterly separate from both the king of the north and the king of the south. In other words, a third power is clearly involved here, and that reference is certainly to the king who is introduced at the beginning of 1136.
Thank you very much, Elder Kerr. That was a fascinating presentation. And I would just say you've once again thrown a hand grenade into our discussions and casting aside all the old certainties of 2 years ago. It's a fascinating presentation you've made. And let's open it up for questions or comments. My first thought was, okay, so if the king of the north is not the papacy, which many Adventists believe by verse 40, are we to understand, you understand that to be the Ottoman Empire in verse 40? In 1798, the events of Napoleon invading Egypt and the Mamluks fighting him, then Napoleon going up the coast to Joppa and being forced back by the Ottomans. And if so, where in that verse 40 through 45 are we today, if the king of the north is not the papacy?
The first phrase there of verse 40, where it says, at the time of the end, can also be, and you can show it in many other different places in the Bible, where that same phrase, at the time, can be in the time or during the time, etc. So I don't necessarily see Daniel 11:40 as 1798, but during the time of the end, these things will happen. From verse 40 to 45. So I don't know. Anyway, so I don't see verse 40. It has to be that 1798 year.
So who would you then say is the king of the north in 40 through 45?
Well, that's a $64,000 question, isn't it? The only definition that Gabriel gave us in verse 40 in the chapter is whatever controls those parts of the broken up Alexandrian Empire. That's how they were first defined. All of us agree that that's how it was first defined. Our trouble is with how do we define it in verse 40. So I would, at this point, still up for grabs, my tentative idea is to continue with how Gabriel introduced them, and that is whoever controls that area of the world, either north or south.
Thank you very much.
And certainly those things can change over time.
All right, so thank you for that. Okay, let's open it up for wider questions and comments. There was quite a lot of interplay between your paper and Dr. Tarsi Lee's paper. Your discussion of his translation, clearly you've read it. There's some commentary going through your paper on Dr. Lee's paper. And it was just interesting to see the interplay and also the points of differences of interpretation, particularly around 11:14. And the robbers of thy people, that phrase there, and they shall establish the vision. I thought that was a very interesting discussion as you link that back to the vision of Daniel at chapter 8. So this Daniel, from what I'm hearing you say, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are really explanations of the overall vision of Daniel 8.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right, so, folks, any questions or comments on this paper? Yes, Brother Hayden. So, Brother Hayden, if you can give us your name, Brother Hayden, then we know that Brother Hayden is speaking.
Yes, hello, my name's Tim Hayden. I really like that presentation. I tend to hold to the same belief in verse 14 that Rome is introduced there. And I know not a lot of people hold that anymore, but it was understood that way for quite some time. And to me, it seems obvious and pretty clear. And you've had a lot of things in there, brother, that I had, but you had some more and some quotes that I didn't have, and I had a few quotes that you didn't have. But I think I'm right in line with you in that part of Daniel 11. And I would like to hear what Tarsi Lee has to say about the robbers of thy people and the one in verse 16 that comes against him, and to identify or let us know if that is logical, that there can be a connection to that, because I think that's important. Also, when it comes to the end of the chapter, though, I do not, in my interpretation, I do not call Rome the king in the north until verse 40. I have Rome from verse 14 going all the way to verse 40, but then there's some reasons I call Rome the king in the north at that point because of what happens at the end of time. So there's some differences we have there. And obviously, since I hold to the atheism view at the end of time, there's going to be differences. But thank you for that presentation, though. It was tremendous. I thank you.
All right, thank you. If we could ask Dr. Tarsi Lee, would you be able to respond to that comment from Brother Tim Hayden? Maybe in more general terms to the thoughts of Elder Hare as he mentioned them in his paper.
I'm not sure where to begin. I think some of these questions were asked earlier. Back to verse 16, perhaps. No, back to verse 14, okay? The question is, are the violent ones the ones who do violence to God's people, or are they the violent ones among God's people? And I mentioned earlier that it could go either way. Mm-hmm. The only thing about it is that they have to stumble after it. Now, I know that Uriah Smith got around it by saying they eventually they stumble. But I'm not sure about that. It's possible. But I'm just thinking that somehow, reading through the context, it seems like they stumble pretty quickly. That's the way I get it. So this is why I went with violent ones among your people. But like I said, the expression itself could go either way, okay? It seems that they would stumble before too long. On verse 16, I'm just trying to answer, the questions, not that I have the ultimate answer. On verse 16, where it says, the one who comes, that's a mouthful for translating just one word in Hebrew, which is what we have to keep in mind. That one word has the article. And I understand that Dr. Gain will be speaking some more about this later. But in the context there, I would say it's the one who was supposedly coming in verse 15, which is why I would connect that with the king of the north. On verse 36, where we have the expression, let me find it here, where we have the expression, the king. Again, it's the article that seems to refer to someone that has already been mentioned in the text. So I understand again that Uriah Smith saw this as a new king, and because of what it says in the following verses and so on, Uriah Smith took it to be atheism, which meant this is the French Revolution. However, again, there seems to be a reference to a king that's already part of the narrative because of the article. In Hebrew, like Greek actually, there's only one kind of article, which is the the definite article. Whereas in English, you have the definite article and an indefinite article. Now, contrary to what some people think, the fact is you can express everything in every language. The problem is how to express it, not necessarily that it cannot be expressed. So how do you express those three ideas in English? A king, the king, king, when you only have two ways of expressing it. Okay, with the article, the king, or without the article. And the answer is that in languages like that, such as Greek and Hebrew, when you have the article, it can function in two different ways. It can function either as an expression of a definite king, or it can function as king in general. But if you want to express a king, that's when you leave it without the article. So the article could mean the fire, or fire as a concept in general. But if you want to express a fire rather than the fire, then you need to leave the article out. And so in order to say a king rather than the king, or the concept of king in general, then you would have to not have the article. Mm-hmm. So that's my, I don't know if I missed something that I need to address. Verse 40, yeah. I forget who it was who emailed this, or part of this quotation to me a couple years ago. And I looked at it, and my response is, I don't think that what Dr. Littke says is really in contradiction to what I had to say, as much as it's a question of how he understood the context. So if you understand verse 36 to be talking about someone, a third party, then what he's saying might play a role in it. But I don't think you can take what he said there just on the basis of the text alone, without any other context. I don't know if I'm making sense. So I think the disagreement there is more having to do with understanding the context, understanding whether verse 36 is speaking of a third participant or not. Once you have a third participant, then perhaps, the whole idea that it wouldn't make sense for this to be worded the way it's worded in verse 40, I can understand better what he's talking about. But without the context that verse 36 introduced another entity, then what he says about verse 40 would really not make as much sense. So the difference is not how he explains verse 40 as much as the fact that underlying that explanation is the understanding that there is a third entity that arose in verse 36. And if that's not the case, then his argument in verse 40 is not applicable. That's, yeah. Anything I missed?
Just to comment on they shall stumble in verse 16. We understand that Rome from chapter 8, the little horn is both pagan and papal. And we see that throughout our understanding of chapter 11 as we see both pagan and papal there. So when it says it comes to his end, it's talking about both pagan and papal. And if you go over to back to chapter 8, to the vision itself, verse 25 of chapter 8, it talks about the little horn there where it stands up against the Prince of Princes, but he's broken without hand. Well, we know that that's not an immediate breaking, even though it's right there, the same phrase of the same verse. We realize that, yes, the papacy's been standing up against the Prince of Princes for well over 1,000 years, but he's going to be broken without hand. When we look at Revelation, we see there where the papacy, it's going to look like the whole world is following the beast. The whole world, who can make war against him? He's dominating, and nobody has any power to come against him. He's just going to take over the world and rule it. He's on top, he's winning. But from a Bible standpoint, yes, we're going to see that, but our hope is that at the end, he's going to be taken out. He's going to be broken without hand by God himself. So God is looking like in Daniel 8:25, he's standing up against the Prince of Princes, but when he looks like there's no opposition and he's got control of the whole entire world, God will break him. And the same thing here in chapter 11, where the robbers of thy people are both pagan and papal Rome, because both did do those things throughout the rest of the chapter. He is going to be broken. He is going to fall. And of course, that happens when we get to verse 45, where he eventually comes to his end. So that's how I would answer that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gain, and then our friend here. Okay.
Thank you. That was really a wonderful presentation, very clear and wonderful slides. You're an evangelist and you do great graphics. I really liked what you said about chazon. That was a great connection, tracing it back to Daniel 8, chazon, and I think you're right, that it's trying to fulfill that chazon. That makes really good sense. That was convincing. I have so many other comments. I don't know where to begin, but just a couple, because some of these I'll address tomorrow in my presentation. First of all, just on Daniel 11:14, it starts off v'itim hahem, which is introducing a parenthetical statement. First, it's disjunctive syntax. It's not starting with a verb consecutive. It's not just continuing. So it's a parenthesis.
Yes.
You were right in verse 13. He's, coming, and then he's going to come in verse 15. But in between here, we have this parenthesis, right?
Yes.
And the first item in the parenthesis is, just at that time, a side issue is many will rise against the king of the south. And I think you nailed it, what that is, Ptolemy V. The Rosetta Stone is set right in that context. But then the rest of the verse, after the etnach, uvnei paritse amicha yinasu, the violent ones of your people or whatever will exalt themselves to set up or make stand the vision,
Yes.
but they will stumble. Okay, so that is in that same context in those days. Be'etimahem. So it's a little snippet. It's not a big thing like the introduction of a whole empire with a supersession going on. It's just a side issue. And then, as Dr. Lee says, they'll stumble there, not hundreds of years later. So this is not talking about Rome. One other issue there's a question we could ask. This word paritz that is translated either, you translated it robbers like the KJV, and Uriah Smith followed that. Tarsi translated it, violent ones. But in Isaiah 35, verse 9, is the only other place where we find that noun in construct. And the question is, is it an objective genitive or is it a partitive genitive in the construct? And there it says, there will not be there a lion, uv, which would be and or, paritz hayot, a paritz of the hayot. Now, hayot means animals. So there, and the translations all translate it, including the Septuagint, I think correctly, a paritz, a violent one of the animals, that is like the lion, a violent one among the animals. So to me, coming back to Daniel 11:14, it makes the best sense to take it as partitive, as Dr. Lee thinks it is likely, particularly then because they stumble. But then at the beginning of verse 16, you mentioned this but. There's no but in the Hebrew. It's vaya'as. It's a vav consecutive. It's just continuing. The but is in translations, and they are just contrasting it with, there'll be no strength to stand, but he who comes. It's a logical thing that the translator says there could be a but there in the translator's mind, the English translator. But there are some English translators that don't do that, JPS and Net Bible. They don't do that, and it's just a consequence. He who comes against him will do as he wills. It's just summarizing what happened. He's just won a big battle. Now he can do whatever he wants here. And then he'll stand in the glorious land. This is not talking about the whole Middle East. This is talking about between Egypt and, that is Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria. At that point, he gained the domination, and they didn't really lose it. Ptolemaic Egypt was downhill all the way after that. So it's a very significant thing for, and the one who does that would be Antiochus III. The one, coming down to verse 36, there's a very good reason why verse 36 has "and the king." Why the king? Because in the previous verses from 32b, you have an interlude here speaking about someone other than the king. You have the people of God are the focus. So it shifts its focus to the people of God who have been his victims. And so then it's resuming, it's a resumptive kind of a thing, to resume, to make sure that you know now we're talking about that individual that we were talking about before, the king. And so that makes perfect sense, and I accept what Dr. Lee says about the anaphora there, that the king just simply is resuming, talking about the king and talking about the same ruler, namely the king of the north. Now coming down to verse 40, Dr. Littke, with all due respect, did not have access to Direct's work, as Dr. Lee does. So he's missing something there. He sees a parallel and he's making an interpretation based on an assumption that he has. I'm a Hebrew scholar like Littke, so is Dr. Lee. We see it differently. So for him to say that's the way a Hebrew scholar has to see it, well, no, not necessarily. And there in verses 41 and following, what you see is exactly what is started with the king of the north shall rush upon him. And then what are the countries that are being overtaken? They're clearly southern countries. You've got Egypt, and you've got Libya and Cush. These are southern. So clearly you have a king of the north who's taken over the king of the south. There's no third party here in this conflict. There's only two of them, and the king of the north is getting the better of it. But then finally, the king of the north, when you come to passages like 2 Thessalonians 2, the lawless one, which is the papacy, is slain by the breath of his coming. And we find in Daniel, earlier chapters in Daniel, that he's broken by no human hand, and that's the papacy. And this is the king of the north here, who is finally, he'll come to his end with none to help him. That's like, there's no, by no human hand. It's the same power, it's the papacy. And the papacy here is the king of the north because he's come and defeated the king of the south. So the whole contextual framework really fits a two-way struggle between king of the north, king of the south, with the king of the north being the same as in verse 36 and earlier. And if he is the papacy there, then, which is papal Rome, it makes sense he's the king of the north because that comes from pagan Rome earlier. And then in verses 20 and 21, you have al-Kano, in his place, in his position. What's that position? King of the north. And then the Rome comes in at that point. Okay, those are just a few comments. You probably disagree with some of it, but
Absolutely.
I just thought I would point that out to you.
Yes, he does. So, before we ask this question, brother, do you want to respond to any of Dr. Gaines' comments before we take the next question?
No.
No. All right. Okay.
I think my whole presentation is a commentary.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, brother, go ahead.
Yes, Wayne Davidson. You did a great job, Elder Kim. I appreciate that. You mentioned clearly that the Kazan of Daniel chapter 8 is really the interpretation that is being documented in Daniel 11. And when you go back to Daniel 8, the power that comes after the breakup of Alexander's kingdom is documented as the little horn. Now, in that passage, it says, out of one of them shall come forth a little horn. And that there are 3 verses that actually speak of that power, the little horn, because it speaks of it both in its pagan and its papal phases. So there are really only 2 powers before the conversation of the 2 angels. So if there are only 2 powers there in the actual Kazan, wouldn't it stand to reason that in the interpretation of that vision that there would only still be 2 powers and not 3? And could it be that the reason why there may be seen as though it's 3 is because Rome, pagan Rome, existed beyond the beginning of the bishops of Rome, which eventually became papal Rome. So there's some overlap there, and it could be seen as though there is 3, but really, in fact, based on the vision itself, that there are only 2.
Who are the 2 you are saying?
No, I'm saying in the vision itself, in
Yes.
the Kazan of chapter 8, the little horn represents pagan Rome and papal Rome.
Yes.
And we understand that. I don't think there's any discrepancy in terms of our understanding of that. So
No.
if we're bound by that understanding,
Yes.
that the vision that comes after the breakup of Alexander's kingdom, before the conversation of the angel, there are only 2 powers there, pagan Rome and papal Rome. Would it not stand to reason that in the interpretation, which you agree is a direct correlation to the vision, what we find in Daniel chapter 11 is a direct correlation to the vision of Daniel, of the Kazan. So therefore, in the interpretation, should we then not find only 2? And if it is seemed to be 3, could it be the overlapping period where we have, the pagan Rome continuing but pagan Rome ending after the Bishop of Rome actually became significant. In other words, the Bishop of Rome started out in the apostolic times. I mean, they became significant. The papacy did not occur until 539. I agree, but the inception of that, the mystery of iniquity that Paul saw, began before the breakup of the Roman Empire. So where you may be seeing 3, it's because of that overlapping period where they were both in play at the same time.
Well, in the vision of chapter 8, the little horn is 1. And so it's only 1 power, Rome. It has 2 phases, but it's still 1 power, Rome. In Daniel chapter 8, Rome goes against the king of the north, and it goes against the king of the south, and it goes and stands in the glorious land. That's Daniel 8:9. So we should see the same thing happening in Daniel 11, and we do. We see Rome attack the king of the north, attacks the king of the south, and stands in the glorious land. So that's a direct correlation between the vision of Daniel 8 and the interpretation of Daniel 11. So those are three powers there in that are, so you have the little horn, which is one, pagan and papal Rome, just two separate phases. And then you have the king of the north, and then you have the king of the south. So those three powers are seen in both the vision and in Daniel chapter 11, as well as in Daniel chapter 8, it's the consequences for Daniel's people. And when Gabriel comes back in chapter 10, he says, I'm going to show you what's going to happen to your people in the latter days. So you've got that component mixed in there as well. So you've got the king of the north, the king of the south, and God's people that are part of the mix. But there's only three dominant powers in chapter, verse 40 and following, and that's Rome, one, the king of the north, and the king of the south. Yep. How I see it anyway.
Yep, but again, what you're referring to in Daniel 8 is part of the interpretation. I'm talking about the vision itself. And
the vision itself, verse 9 is part of the vision. Correct. Yeah.
Where the only entity that is spoken of is that follows the breakup of the Alexander's kingdom is the little horn.
Yes.
There's only one, and we understand that little horn. And this is the vision itself I'm talking about, not the interpretation that the angel began to give afterward. Now, afterward, yes, it does mention what the king of fierce countenance will do and the various directions of the little horn's pursuits. But in the vision itself, there's only one power that's spoken of, which is the little horn, which we understand to be pagan and papal Rome.
Correct.
So therefore, all the other explanations, interpretations that follow must fit that paradigm.
Yes,
so
agreed.
If I we'll come to Pastor Nelson here, but if I understand you, Brother Davidson, what I hear you to be saying is in Daniel 8, verse 8, you have Alexander the Great, the little horn that grows exceedingly great, but it's broken, and the four prominent horns go to the four winds of the heaven. We understand that as a breakup of Alexander's empire. After that, in verse 9, you have the little horn coming, which is pagan Rome, then papal Rome. But there's nothing more about the king of the north or the king of the south, which is among the four kingdoms, the breakup of Alexander's empire, anywhere in the actual vision itself. So what I'm hearing him say is that the king of the north and king of the south in Daniel 8, they occur, the Rome defeats them at the start of its growth to power.
Yes.
But there's no indication in the vision that the king of the north and the king of the south are manifestations at the end of time in the vision of Daniel 8. Is that what you're saying, brother?
No, I'm saying that.
So the point is that if the king of the north and king of the south are included among the four kingdoms that come out of the fall of Alexander's empire...
No. We have Alexander's kingdom.
Yeah.
Okay? And after Alexander's kingdom, the only other symbol that is a part of the dream or the kazan is the little horn.
Yeah.
So therefore, whatever interpretation is given subsequent to the conversation of the two angels as part of the interpretation must fit what is given in the vision. So the king of the north, king of the south must fit within the context of the little horn.
Yeah, I agree. So
I agree.
So by implication, if the king of the north and king of the south in Daniel 8 are really only found in verse 8 there, the four prominent horns, that's the breakup of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are included among the breakup. After that, you have the rise of Rome to power, but there's no mention again in the vision of a king of the north or a king of the south or any directional elements within it. So it would appear that would then question whether the king of the north and the king of the south in Daniel 11:40 are really what Uriah Smith is talking about. Why do they come to later prominence when they only come to prominence at the start of Rome's rise to power? Yeah, okay. Interesting questions. All right, we have a bunch of answers here. Okay, answers. We're going to have Pastor Nelson, and then Brother Wall, and then Brother Yoda. We'll take it in order that the hands are raised.
Yeah, thank you, Kim, for your presentation. My question is regarding kind of the issue that this brother just raised, too. And if I understood you correctly, you had a slide that showed Rome in coming to 3 different areas. And the south, the east, and it looked like you were pointing to the territory of the king of the north, and then the glorious land. And you seem to indicate, if I remember right, that those things happened consecutively and in order, in chronological order.
They happen historically, chronologically in Daniel 11, but not they're not historically chronological in chapter 8.
Okay, so when the little horn waxes great toward the south, and then toward the east, and then toward the pleasant land, you were not saying that that's chronological?
No.
Okay.
Chapter 11, it is chronological.
Okay, so that's what I understood you to say when I heard you the first time, and that's what tripped a question in my mind. So you're saying that the territory of the south is a reference to the king of the south, as we find, and you're suggesting that toward the east would be a reference toward the king of the north. Okay. All right, so I've historically viewed that a little bit differently than you. I figured the south was dealing with North Africa, and then the east was Mithridates, and then Pompey coming into the glorious land after that. So that explains that. So I guess I misunderstood what you said.
It kind of goes around the, Rome goes first in the territory of the king of the north, then Israel area, and then Egypt. So it kind of goes around the horn there, historically, as far as a timeline.
Just note in passing that the 3-way interpretation is one of the oldest interpretations outside of the scripture. It goes all the way back to Jerome and others. So what you're sharing here isn't something that Uriah Smith kind of dreamt up in a vacuum. If you go back to Jerome and other historical Protestant figures, the 3-way interpretation is quite well attested to. Okay, and Brother Wall?
Okay, with reference to the 3 entities, or the seeming 3 entities that are talked about in verse 40, and it's well put here. I'm not sure whose the name is. Is it Richard? The name of Richard
Litke, yes.
Yes. And mentioned the 2 main entities are King of the South and King of the North. And then it's talking about their object, single object of their fury.
Yes.
I'm not so sure. I think this would make sense with reference to the many, but with reference to their attacks. They're attacking each other, aren't they? Because it's saying that the king of the south shall come at him, namely the king of the north, and then the king of the north would respond back. Or how is this being pointed at? So in this case, and what Brother Davidson was talking about as 3 seemingly 2, it wouldn't fit in this context because this is 2 opposing powers, king of the south, king of the north, and it's not talking about one particular power as in chapter 8, talking about the little horn in 2 faces. So it's not the same thing, Brother Dwayne, that is being talked about. But my question is, what is the 3rd entity being pointed out?
Well, in Daniel 11:40, you have the king of the south pushing at him, and you have the king of the north pushing at him. And so, who is the him? And so the him refers back to the king of verse 36. So
And who would that be?
that's the papacy.
And in verse 36, is it identified as king of the north?
No. It's identified just as the king. And then
The
all
king
these,
without reference. Okay.
yeah, there's no directional label given to that king. He's described for 4 verses. He's going to do this and this and this and this, and lots of description. 9% of the chapter is within those verses describing who this king is, but no mention of what his title is. So with all that description and that amount of the chapter, you would think that if he really wanted to know us, he wouldn't even have to use all that description. He could just say, hey, this is the king of the north.
Right.
But the fact that he doesn't makes a stronger case for that it isn't, because he mentions the king of the north after those 4 verses. So it's the first phrase of verse 40, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. The him has to be previously mentioned, and that's the king that's been talked about for the last 4 verses, 36 through 39.
Right.
And then if that king of verse 36 through 39 can be shown conclusively, scripturally, that it is the king of the north, then you have 2 powers in verse 40. But if that king in verse 36 is not the king of the north, then you have 3. The king of the south coming at him, and the king of the north coming at him. Both of those kings in verse 40 are attacking the papacy.
Right. And if the him then is the third entity in here, then the third entity just kind of get lost there because it never gets mentioned afterwards.
No, it goes right through to the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, just clarify that. That's a really good point there. If the him in verse 40 is attacked by the south and then by the north, all right, you say then the him somehow survives those attacks and continues all the way through.
And goes right through, yes.
All right, so who then are the king of the north and king of the south in verse 40?
I'm sorry?
Who then, if that is the king or the papacy from
Yes.
verse 36, who then is the king of the south and the king of the north in verse 40?
Yeah, we talked about that already.
Well, I'm asking you now.
And I said the current default position, at least my default position, is who Gabriel originally said the king of the north and the king of the south are. Those powers that control the north and south of Alexander's original kingdom. Those, at the time these verses will be fulfilled, pointing at my computer screen here, at the time those verses will be fulfilled, those designations of who those powers are could change, because I don't know that we have seen that yet, because those things happen during the time of the end. So right now it's whoever controls those 2 areas, but who knows, with the way the world is going, who could be controlling those 2 areas when those verses actually begin to be fulfilled.
So just to clarify, the Uriah Smith view held that the king of verses 36 through 39 was the French Revolution.
Yes.
And the him in the 3-way struggle of verse 40 was Napoleon, and the king of the south was the Mamluks, and the king of the north was the Ottomans.
Yes.
That's how he interpreted it. And even though you're here kind of representing the neo-Uriah Smith stream, you differ from Uriah Smith and John Whitcomb in saying that the king of 36-39 is not the Napoleonic France, it is the papacy.
Yes.
And once you accept that, once you take that position, then that throws the identity of the king of the north and king of the south into a lot more like, we don't know who that is. That's the logical consequence until we see it happening.
Yes.
All right. So we hang on. We've got Brother Yoda over here, and then Dr. Markovich, and then Pastor Rosenberg, and then gentleman over here. Now, we need to finish this by in another 15 minutes maximum, okay? So let's keep these questions short. Thank you, Brother Yoda.
All right, yeah, I really appreciate the presentation. I probably like it mainly because I agree with the 3-person in this chapter. and that verse 40 depicts king of the north and the king of the south coming against a third party, a king of verse 36. I'd mentioned earlier about the Seleucids and Ptolemies as not being in Daniel 8. And so they're not in Daniel 8 as earthly entities in verses 5 to 15. When we get down to verse 40, we're not talking Seleucids and Ptolemies anymore, but they're still the king of the north and south. And therefore, they're not in Daniel 8 either, in my view. But the king that they come against in verse 36 could be in verse, and is, I think, which is Rome. And so I just wanted to point that out. If the Seleucids and Ptolemies as a foundational type of the end time eschatological kings of the north and south, if they're not in Daniel 8, well, we should not project them into Daniel 8 when we get to verse 40. So, just a point.
Okay. Thank you very much. Pastor Rosenberg? All right, okay. Dr. Markovich?
I am not an expert on Daniel. I am here to learn from all of you guys. But just a couple of weeks ago, in anticipation of this meeting, I decided to read all over again Uriah Smith's book on Daniel, Interpretation of Daniel. And as I was reading it, keeping in mind that we have those four major visions, so to speak, the very end of each vision defines the vision. What is the issue, the core issue of the vision? As I mentioned earlier, in second chapter, it is that all these kingdoms will disappear, God's kingdom will come and remain for good. In the second chapter, in the second vision, there's chapter 7, Daniel has a vision. Now the whole focus and the core issue is, who is the king of Israel? In the end, it is the Son of Man who receives all the powers. He's the judge, he's everything. He judges even now this new symbol that comes out, little horn. And already little horn is different from the dragon from which it comes, because it has a religious characteristics and so on. And then we go in the third vision when we talk about the sanctuary. And here, yes, we have a goat and we have what's the name?
The ram.
Ram.
Mm-hmm.
But it is the question about sanctuary, cleansing of the sanctuary. It is about the atonement, cosmic atonement. That's the core issue. Forget about kingdoms, forget about the kings. Now we're talking about this. And then it moves into this chapter 9 and then comes to chapter 10. And Gabriel tells Daniel in chapter 10, there is a very interesting line in chapter 10 and verse 14. I have to come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future. And the vision concerns the time yet to come. And then we get into the most important section of chapter 11, and that is Daniel 5 to 12:4. And here I'm listening to, I start reading all along as I was reading Uriah Smith's book. Kind of everything makes sense, everything is okay, I understand. He seems going to the right direction. And when I came to chapter 11, everything falls apart. Where is discussion? And I'm listening to your presentation, all of that. Where is concern about God's people? 12:1 tells us, in those days, Michael will stand up. It's the core issue of this whole vision is not Antiochus Epiphanes, battles, Rome, all of that. It is about God's people. And Gabriel is fighting with spiritual powers, Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece. All of these people are against God's people, to deceive them, to persecute them, to somehow estrange them from the appointed one who died in chapter 9. And when I read church history, I see how the church, supposedly God's church, it is being hit with all kinds of deceptive teachings, false teachings. You can name it. You can go from Marcion, you can talk about Justin Martyr, you can talk about Gnosticism, you can talk about Arianism, you can talk about one church father after the other, monasticism, mysticism, all of these things are entering. Comes to the point in the about 12th, 13th century that the church is literally the enemy of God's people, an enemy of God. It murders people, it kills people who are not submitting to its authority. And for somehow, I mean, all this talk, the little horn, becomes, I mean, literally becomes the enemy of God. And now when I listen to this, we come to chapter 11, and somehow we lost the sense about what's happening to God's people, what's happening to God's church, lost somehow this sense of deception, and Satan is working hard. And even today, he's working hard. What's happening today? Somehow everything tells me that we're talking about King of the North, King of the South. But we have in the book of Revelation, Ellen White says that answers to Daniel are in book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, you go and what do you see? Yes, there is a dragon, but there is a beast out of the sea and there is a beast out of the earth. Maybe those two are what Daniel talks, or what it is told to us in Daniel 11, 5 to 45. So my question is, maybe under the influence of Uriah and the previous writers who were coming up with this interpretation, we entangled ourselves into trying to interpret, going in such a details, which is all impressive, but somehow it doesn't give me the answer. And it doesn't fit with the historical record.
Yeah, so Dr. Markovich, we heard this morning of 130 sentences with 40 or 50 dependent clauses.
Okay.
Can you come to your question?
I'm just asking, in your presentation, Dr. Kier, am I correct in that, pronouncing your name?
Kim.
Kier.
Yeah.
Okay.
No doctor.
How do you respond to this verse? I came to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future. To your people.
How do I explain that? Well,
How would you answer? Okay, in the material that you presented, which is heavily based on Daniel, Uriah Smith's interpretation, am I correct in there? I don't see Uriah Smith answering that. He falls apart to me.
Well, if you look at the final, what's going to happen to the people at the very end?
No. All throughout the end, in the future.
Well, it's spoken of as you get down to, especially from verse 30, 31 and following, it tells what happens to God's people during the papal persecution, how God's people are going to be burned at the stake, they're going to be killed, so there's much in there about what's happening to God's people. And then at the very end, you've got chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, that tells again what's going to happen to God's people. Some are going to be raised, some, like in verse 2 and verse 1, there everyone is going to be delivered, everyone that's found written in the book. So there's quite a bit that through chapter 11 and chapter 12 says what's going to happen to God's people. So I don't see any conflict there with verse 14 of chapter 10 and what's the narration of chapter 11, there's a fair amount of information about what's going to happen through God's people right through the ages, and especially at the very end.
Oh, well, I don't want to spend time here. I'm going to simply listen and try to figure out and understand. But as I said, I read Uriah Smith, and when it came to that point, everything fell apart. I said, okay, Uriah Smith lost it here. I'm not saying that there is a confrontation. What I'm saying is that there is some missing the point
Yes.
from that point
Well,
on.
the context of chapter 8 is the sanctuary. That's the big focal point that comes to kind of a crescendo there when the questions are asked, how long? How long is the sanctuary going to be trodden underfoot, etc.? So we should find, if that's the focal point of Daniel chapter 8, the animals are not that are used are sanctuary animals. What's going on here in that chapter is a lot about the sanctuary. Should we not then see some of that in the actual interpretation? That's my question, rather than an answer just throwing that question out to everybody here. If we see so much of the consequences for the sanctuary and for God's people in chapter 8, should we not see that also in chapter 11? We should. Yeah, we should. I think we should.
All right, Pastor Rosenberg, and I think, well, okay, we need to keep it quick because we need to move on to the next presentation as well. So, Pastor Rosenberg.
So Kim, I probably missed it in the massive information, but at what point do you see the papacy showing up in Daniel 11?
From verse 23 to approximately verse 30 is the transition from pagan to papal, and then the dominance of papal is from verse 31 forward.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Gentleman over here.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is, we are told that there is a section in Daniel 11 that hasn't been fulfilled yet. Which one, in your opinion, is the section that hasn't been fulfilled?
40 to 45.
Pardon?
Verse 40 to verse 45.
40. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And Brother Roger, last question here. Please keep it short and sweet, Brother Roger.
I guess I don't so much say I have a question per se, as I'm listening to questions that were asked about the 2,300 days. The 2,300 days, I guess, as in your interpretation, is the parameter set on what the time period could be. That would be my thought, very simply. And basically, if the 2,300 days ends, then there's nothing in Daniel beyond, outside. It talks about the coming of Christ. There's nothing can be in there beyond the 2,300 days, because the ending in chapter 12 says, blessed is he who comes what? To the 1,290 days. Blessed is he who comes to the 1,335 days. And all of those are the ending of what? The same time period, the end of the 2,300 days. But I will say this, is somebody asked about what is the, God's people is the center of, or the purpose of Daniel chapter, of the prophecies of Daniel. You got to go back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, when he was read verses, because we were short of time, verses 29 and 45. Nebuchadnezzar had some thoughts in his mind of what was going to come to pass from his perspective. So it's a vision of the earthly kingdoms, because Israel had lost their temporal domain. So the natural question is how long will it be before the domain is returned or established to the people of God? I'll just leave it, stop there, and ask everybody to read Daniel chapter 12, verse 10. The wicked shall not understand, but the wise will.
All right, thank you very much, Brother Roger. And at that, we're going to have to draw this segment to a close. I would like to thank you, Elder Kim Kier, for another thought-provoking presentation. And that presentation, the notes, not the PowerPoint, but the notes are on the website. You can download it, and if you want to connect with Pastor Kier, he'll be with us for the rest of this weekend, or you can write to him directly on email, I guess. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pastor Kier, and once again, you've added a valuable contribution to our discussions. Thank you very much. All right, it's now 3:25, and we will take a 10-minute break because we need to give Dr. Frank Hardy justice and time. So we will begin in 10 minutes' time. For those of you watching online, we'll begin at 3:35 Eastern Standard Time. So if you're going to go and get a breath of fresh air or go to the restroom, please make it short and sweet. Thank you very much. Okay, so Brother Bob, if we can just, we just want to try out, there it is.
There we go.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to invite you to return. And we've had a spiritual feast so far today. And now we come to our final presentation for the day. So, Sister Rosenberg, I see you leaving. Could you kind of give a shout out to the people in the foyer to come in, please? Thank you. So we'd like to invite you to take your seats. And for our last presentation today, we have Dr. Frank Hardy, who is, his doctorate was in linguistics, if I remember right, and has taken a keen interest in the Hebrew and the syntax of the book of Revelation. This, I believe, is Dr. Hardy's at least third presentation at these conferences, or maybe the fourth. And I would encourage you, if you can go back to the Daniel 11 prophecy website, you'll look at the papers that are there from the previous conferences. You'll find some excellent material, particularly material that emphasizes the centrality of Christ in the structure of Daniel 10, 11, and 12. And today, Dr. Hardy is going to be talking about the role of synthesis in exegesis. And so the presentation is on the website. You can the paper presentation, not the file, but the text itself is available on the website. We invite you to download it and study it at your own leisure at a later time. But let's bow our heads and we'll invite the Holy Spirit to anoint Dr. Hardy this afternoon. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gifting you've given Dr. Hardy. Father, thank you for his faithful years of study and reflection on your word. And Father, I thank you that we see the fruit of your Spirit manifest in his character. Now, Lord, as he shares with us what you've put upon his heart, I pray that you will speak through him and for him. And Lord, I pray that the knowledge he shares will not just puff us up, but I pray that it will build us up in mutual and brotherly and sisterly love. So, Father, grant us greater understanding and greater love through his presentation today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, good afternoon. This afternoon, I'm going to be trying to do two things, which may be hazardous. The one thing is, I would like to make some meaningful comments on Dr. Lee's translation. That's what we're here to do. And the second thing is, I would like to make some sort of comments addressing the needs and interests of the Atheism Caucus, which I've been asked to represent. So in regard to the translation, I have some specific points and some more general points. More specifically, we'll be talking about the syntax of Shav in verses 28 through 30. And more broadly, we'll be talking about the need to have more than one data stream. In the translation, the focus is primarily on anaphora. And this produces exegetical strings, like starting in 16 or even 14, 16, 21, 29, 36, and to this we could add 40, and it all turns into one thing, and there's a sameness about this. But a point I'll be trying to make this afternoon is that until we put the transitions into Daniel 11, which Dr. Lee did not attempt to do, he disclaimed that task. His focus was elsewhere. But until we put the transitions into Daniel 11, and until we approach this material from multiple points of view, as many points of view as we can get, we won't be making exegetical progress. So let's move on into the paper. We'll start with syntax. The verses considered below are 28 through 40. By doing this, we will have far-reaching implications for our understanding of what precedes, what follows, some concerns of the Atheism Caucus, and some technical details put forward in the translation. We begin with the syntax of verses 28 through 30. Daniel 11:28 mentions two wars. We know these are different wars because in them the king has different opponents. In the one case, north is fighting against south. In the other, north is fighting against the Holy Covenant. If the king campaigns in the south and then returns home, that war is over. And similarly, if he fights against the Holy Covenant and returns home, that war is over as well. The first war against the south occupies verses 25 through 28a. These verses have their own internal chiastic structure, which we will not be able to discuss here. But we do have this in a table up on the screen. In the above structure, lines A, B, B, A contain antithetical parallels. Set out, return home, wage war, seek to avoid waging war. These are opposites. While in lines C, D, D, C, we have synonymous parallels. Not stand equals be swept away. Plots devised against him equals close associates break him. Adding more verses to this structure would destroy its balance. Verse 28b stands alone because here the king fights not against the south but against the Holy Covenant. Having done so, he returns home. The word translated return in both 28a and 28b is shav. And we see that in the table on the screen. When shav precedes a noun, as in the above examples, it is simply a predicate meaning return. Thus, vyashov and vashav both function as predicates meaning in context that the king returns home. Shav as an adverbial auxiliary. By contrast, when shav immediately precedes a verb, not a noun, it no longer functions as a predicate. Instead, it serves as an auxiliary meaning again. What gets repeated in such cases is the action of the following verb. This is one of two primary ways in which Hebrew expression expresses repetition. There are other ways, but these are the two primary ways. Verses 29 to 30 offer three examples of this. I generally use ESV as a baseline English translation, but ESV misses the adverbial sense of the above construction all three times it occurs. In the following tables, I show what ESV does and what, in my view, it should have done and how Lee handles the same material. And so we move on to the next table. So this is what ESV does, and this is what it should have done. In the above, let's see, just a moment. Okay. So here we have this table, and the words that are bolded are the ones I wanted to call attention to. So instead of return and come, what's the wording in the previous table? Return and come. It should be translated again, come again. And in the second clause where I have a bolded entry, again be enraged, and in the third, again pay attention. So in each case, the Hebrew is expressing repetition. So here's what Dr. Lee does with this. In the first clause, it's the same. In the third clause, it's the same. So he draws Yashuv Uva together, and he draws Vyashe Vyavein together. So again come and again pay attention. But in the middle clause, he separates the two words. So here we have be disheartened and turn back. Now what he's combining there is v'nich a v'shav, and separating that from v'za'am. So the first part, v'nich a v'shav, would mean he becomes discouraged and turns back. Well, you could draw from that the king retreats, that the king goes in, that the king is defeated. And then separate from that, Basa'am. And in my view, these should have been combined. In Lee's proposed translation, it is the second clause that requires comment. He separates Bashav from Baza'am, placing these adjacent words in different clauses. Such syntax would normally be subject to an adverbial interpretation, but Lee does not consider this obligatory. In the literature available to me, I do not find support for the above understanding of the syntax. The following quote is from the Encyclopedia of Hebrew Language and Literature. Biblical Hebrew, do I not give that? Okay, I don't actually quote this paragraph on a slide. I'm sorry, I'll just read it. Biblical Hebrew had two major auxiliary verb constructions. A two-finite verb construction, and more commonly an auxiliary plus infinitive construction. In the two-finite verb construction, as in V'yashov V'yalen Sham, and again spent the night there, the auxiliary verb always precedes the lexical verb, and both are finite verbs. Formally, in the surface structure, they look like two coordinate finite verbs, but in the underlying structure, they form a syntactic and semantic unity denoting one and the same event. Their surface structure looks like a biclausal or two-clause structure, but their underlying structure is a monoclausal or one-clause structure. I emphasize that auxiliary constructions look like two coordinate finite verbs, such as yashuv uva, or bashav v'za'am, or v'yashev v'yavein. They look like two verbs side by side. But in the underlying structure, they form a syntactic and semantic unity denoting one and the same event. Their surface structure looks like a biclausal or two-clause structure, but their underlying structure is a monoclausal or one-clause structure. This illustrates the concept of synthesis or connectedness. Thus, it appears that the syntax of constructions such as Bashav Za'am, having the form shav plus verb, should not be separated from each other, but should be interpreted together in an adverbial manner. The two verbs that come together to make up such constructions are separate only in their surface representation. In underlying structure, they convey a single idea, which is that a given action is being repeated. And, okay, context. Even if Lee's interpretation were optional, that still would not help, because separating the sense of the two verbs from each other would have to be motivated by contextual considerations. And in fact, the context of this passage solidly supports an adverbial reading. Consider the following points. First, the meaning Lee conveys is against the Hebrew accents. The word v'nik'ah carries the accent zakef katan, which distinguishes it or distances it from Bashav. By contrast, Bashav has the weaker accent tivir. Thus, the Masoretes saw Bashav Za'am as a single clause separate from v'nik'ah. The syntax of Yashuv Uva, Bashav Za'am, and Bashav Yavein is the same in all three cases. There is no purely linguistic reason to treat one clause differently from the others. Number 3, thematically, the king opposes those who support the covenant and supports those who oppose the covenant. From this, it is clear that the author's intent was to express one thought in two correspondingly opposite ways. The thought is the same both times. And 4, apart from these matters, the rest of the section has nothing to say about a king of the south. So interpreting in such a way as to leave open the possibility of a southern victory takes us nowhere. Okay. Evangelical readings. There is an evangelical understanding of verse 30 that does not correspond closely with the text and that causes translators endless problems. I've already mentioned that ESV misses the sense of repetition in all three clauses, and it translates using 4 predicates rather than 3. According to ESV, the king, 1, shall be afraid, 2, and withdraw, 3, and shall turn back, 4, and be enraged. Only predicates 1, 3, and 4 in this series have correlates in the Hebrew. The word withdraw is entirely gratuitous. Although I grant that under other circumstances, that is, if the syntax were different from what it is, such a reading would be lexically possible. NASB takes a similar approach, combining 2 predicates from benich-a, taking the one word, and gives us 2 English words corresponding to that, to get withdraw in fear. So it has withdraw and fear. But the root meaning is simply be discouraged. Thus, 2 English terms derive from one Hebrew word, benich-a, and again the concept of withdrawing is simply added. The reason for such problems has to do with the historical application that many evangelicals wish to support by applying verse 30 to Popilius, the Roman legate who came and ordered Antiochus out of Egypt. Peterson captures the idea perfectly by suggesting, when the Roman ships arrive, he will turn tail and go back home. And this is the evangelical concept of this verse. In Lee's proposed translation, the word withdraw does appear, but is not added because he associates Bashav with benich-a in the preceding clause instead of with baza'am, which follows. So he is translating Bashav as withdraw, turn back as withdraw. This enables him to translate Bashav as withdraw without adding a word that is not there, as in ESV, and without amalgamating 2 quite different words, benich-a and Bashav, as in NASB. So here we have a table showing that. So on the ESV combines the words in one way, and Lee combines the words in another way. So that's the comparison. In the popular view, if the ships of Kittim are Roman, they are therefore northern, which puts Antiochus in the curious role of a king of the south. Perhaps his presence in Egypt is seen as justification for this idea. But if the ships of Kittim are southern, which makes more sense in view of the fact that they oppose the king of the north, there is a question who wins. Translating in such a way as to allow for a southern victory does not account for the fact that the king of the north dominates the rest of the section. There is no further reference to a king of the south until verse 40. My point here is that there's a clear contrast between shav plus noun and shav plus verb in verse 28 and verses 29 to 30 respectively, and that this contrast must be felt in the translation. So here we have the table, and I've highlighted certain words. We have return, and then we have return in the following clause, and then we have again, again, again. And this is the contrast that needs to come through in the translation. And the reason why that's important is that returning means you stop fighting. The wars from which the king returns are over. Now, in the next phrase, we start again. So he again does this, and again does that, and again does the other thing. So the one is coming to an end, and the other means getting a fresh start. It's that difference between stopping and starting that we need to capture at verse 29. Terminology, word choices. What we have just said about stopping and starting is confirmed through the author's choice of vocabulary. And this is entirely different from following the rules of syntax. We've talked about some rules of syntax. Now we're going to talk about something entirely different, but the two come together to form a unified interpretation. Choosing terminology is not the same as obeying the rules of syntax, but although two different things are involved, they support each other. This is what I mean by synthesis in the title of the presentation. That is, that seemingly unrelated things must come together in order to form a united interpretation. And here's Laurendale's quote. The critical question is, where in the outline series of Daniel 11 does the prophetic portrayal pass the first advent of Christ and also enter into the time of the end? The series of Daniel 11 may be believed to enter the time after the cross of Christ from verse 31 onward, because verse 31 speaks about the setting up of the abomination that makes desolate, RSV, profanation of the temple, the taking away of the continual, or burnt offering, or daily, the mediation service. And this is in Gordon Hyde Biblical Research Committee report. So in this, Laurendale is right, but he's understating his case. So here, in the first section of Daniel 11, we have one term that could be considered spiritually significant, the term chazon, and we've talked about this. And then in the second section of Daniel 11, we have three terms that could be considered spiritually significant. But then there's a whole cascade of similar terms. 29 examples in the final third of the chapter. This represents a change. Something is different now. In the above table, 1 over 33, or 3%, of all spiritually relevant terms in Daniel occur in the first third of the chapter, and 3 over 33, or 9.1%, occur in the second third. We don't start getting a heavy concentration of spiritual terms until the last third, where we find 29 over 33, or 87.9%. In my view, the above change involves not just terminology, but a transition between empires. This occurs not at 31, as Laurendale suggests, or verse 30, as we might draw from the above list, but at verse 29. The wars we find there are similar because the parties prosecuting them are similar. Here, the first phase of Roman power gives way to the second phase of Roman power. The transition between the two involves introducing a flood of spiritual terminology, because spiritual Rome is, well, spiritual. Some change of this sort must occur in Daniel 11 to maintain the parallels with earlier chapters, and in my view, it happens here. We now seek to confirm the above hypothesis with material drawn from various types of parallels. So this now is a separate topic. Again, parallels part 1 with Daniel 7:25a and b. In this section of the paper, we examine parallels back to Daniel 7, and we'll consider 25a and b, 25c, and 25d. There are also parallels within Daniel 11, and we'll compare 29 with 35 and 35 with 40. And there are parallels that look forward to Daniel 12. Here we'll talk about a comparison between 11:35 and 36 and 12:6 and 7. Altogether, there are 6 different sets of parallels. All converge on one point. That is that Daniel 11:29 to 39, although bipartite, it comes in 2 parts, is still internally cohesive, that it occurs in the same time frame as both 7:25c and 12:6 and 7, and that it leads up to and immediately adjoins the time of the end in verse 40a. Now, there's been a lot of numbers here, but recall that 7:25c is where the angel mentions a time times and half a time, and that 12:7 is where the angel repeats a time times and half a time. And I'm saying these converge on this passage in Daniel 11. So part 1, okay, and we read, I need to go back, sorry for that lack of coordination. Part 1, Daniel 7:25a and b. The transition which occurs in verses 29 to 30 of Daniel 11 has its counterpart in Daniel 7:23 to 25. After the terrible fourth beast with its 10 horns, there is a little horn which shall be different from the former ones. Immediately after this statement, we come to Daniel 7:25. Consider especially the first two clauses. He shall speak words against the Most High and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. Notice that in 7:25a and b, pride is followed by violence, whereas in 11:29 to 39, violence is preceded by pride, is followed by pride. The only difference here is the sequence of narration, and that is chiastic, A-B-B-A. All the same things are being said. Okay. All right. Part 2, Daniel 7:25c. Daniel 7:25c mentions the times and the law. So what is there in Daniel 11 that corresponds to the times and the law? And I'm going to propose that it's the covenant. There's the Holy Covenant and the covenant. This is verses 30 and 32. I suggest that the covenant or Holy Covenant in these verses includes the 10 Commandments within its scope, where God's creatorship is shown to be the basis for all his dealings with us and all our dealings with him. Part 3, Daniel 7:25d. The time frame for the time, times, and half a time of 7:25d and for what follows is the same in both chapters. The same events are referenced, the same issues are dealt with, and all of this takes place within the same time frame. Once you've set up this parallel, this is the implication of doing that. And you'll notice that I have 4 parallel lines here. First, Daniel 7:25a, where the king utters proud words, 7:25b, where there are violent actions, and then the inverse, violent actions followed by proud words in Daniel 11:29 to 39. But all of these, in my view, are saying the same things about the same period of time, same issues are referenced. These are parallel descriptions. Parallels part 4, and here we'll talk about Daniel 11:29 and 35. We now move on to parallels internal to Daniel 11. The first Hebrew word of verse 29 and the last Hebrew word of verse 35 is lamoed. Coming as these do at the beginning and end of their half section, these paired occurrences of lamoed provide a frame around the intervening verses. We note that this frame has to do only with verses 29 to 35 and does not include verses 36 to 39. The same word, lamoed, occurs earlier in the chapter in verse 27, but its appearance there is not relevant to this discussion. The 2 references to an appointed time in verses 29 and 35 are appointed moments, marking the beginning and end of an appointed period, as noted above from the parallel with 7:25d. And that period is the 1290 days, or 1260 days or years. Okay, parallels part 5. And here we'll talk about Daniel 11:35 and 40. With respect to verses 36 through 39, just before 36 and just after 39, that is in verses 35 and 40, we find matching references to the time of the end. The one reference says, until the time of the end, while the other says, at the time of the end. The important element in these phrases might seem to be the time of the end. But our focus here will be on the words until and at. These words must be interpreted together as a pair. In English, if we say, wait until 6 o'clock, then at 6, give me a call. The expectation is not that at 6 means at any time after 6. It means at 6. Until looks forward to a specific moment of time. That moment occurs when the period leading up to it stops. But of course, the verses in question were not written in English. They were written in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, the preposition ba has a wide range of meanings. Thus, the word at could be translated in, during, and in a variety of other ways. That is, it could be translated quite flexibly if it were not for the parallel passage in verse 35. The argument for a more general understanding of ba in verse 40 will be successful if and to the degree that we set verse 35 aside when interpreting verse 40. But isolating the two verses from each other will not help us achieve a better understanding of either passage. Because there is a clear link between 8 kates and 8 kates, they are identical. And because this link creates a second one between ad and ba, until and at, no connection, no separation is possible. A majority of English translations get this right. There is a direct connection between waiting for something and the time when the period of waiting ends. What refers to a period of history in verse 40 is 8 kates, the time of the end, not ba, that is at. 8 kates does refer to a period of time, but in context, ba refers to a moment of time. That's the point I'm trying to make here. Parallels discussion. In both parts of the section, there is a frame made up of matching pairs of relevant expressions. The first pair, which demarcates verses 29 to 35, and the words there are inside verse 29 and inside verse 35, could be called an inner frame because it resides within its section, while the second pair, which demarcates verses 36 through 39 in verses 35 and 40, could be called an outer frame because it surrounds a section rather than occurring within it. The critical contrast here is between in and around. So on the higher of the two parallel lines, the matching words occur in that group of verses. In the second or lower parallel, a set of parallel line, the matching words are just outside that verse group. It is important that we keep the parts of this frame together. That is, that we keep lamoed together with lamoed. That we keep the parts of the second frame together, ad and ba, or until and at. And that we study the two frames together. All of these correspondences represent parts of what the Holy Spirit has put into the text for our instruction, and all must be drawn out and analyzed together. Notice the wording, refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. Which frame is that? It's the second frame. That's the one we get to first. For it still awaits the appointed time. That's the first frame. You would expect the order to be the inverse, but it's not. The first frame, and the first phrase, the time of the end, pertains to the second frame, while the second phrase, the appointed time, pertains to the first frame. The sequence of narration is not A-B, it is B-A. The two frames do not merely meet in verse 35, they interlock. So they don't just meet like this, they meet like this. Parallels part 6, Daniel 12, 6, and 7, and we'll compare those verses with 11, 35, and 36. There's another connection to notice. Much has been said about the thematic parallels between the time, times, and half a time in 725D, but there is also a set of verbal parallels linking 11, 35, and 36 to 12, 6, and 7. These come in 5 pairs, and we have the table on the screen. So, let's see. My notes say that, okay, I'm going to leave this up just a little bit longer. So in the above table, I have not reordered the clauses. This is the sequence in which they are narrated. There's an almost mathematical quality about the relationships shown here. If we use letters to designate the various columns, what we have is row 1 equals AC, row 2 equals AD, row 3 equals BC, and row 4 equals BD. So let me take another run at this. The parallels are laid out like a truth table. AC, AD, BC, BD, like this. The important thing, however, is to realize that verse 35 is an integral part of 29 to 35. It's the last verse in that half section. So 29 to 35, so we take verse 35. And then 36 to 39, and we take verse 36. So the last verse of the first part, the first verse of the second part, and these, in my view, are representative of their entire section. It's the entire section that is cast in the time frame of the time times and half a time. So the important thing is that the time frame for 725, 1129 to 39, and 12:6 to 7 is the same in each case. It is all identically the same. Summary. In the course of this presentation, I have drawn attention to various facts which may be summarized as follows. And here I put them up for you. That 11, 28, and 29 and 30, that 28 and 29 to 30 are syntactically distinct from each other. That 11:29:35 is thematically parallel to 7:25b, and 11:36 to 39 is thematically parallel to 7:29a. That the covenant or holy covenant of verses 35b and 32 is thematically parallel to the times and the law in 7:25c. That 7:25d supplies the time frame for 7:25a and b, and therefore the time frame for 11:29 to 39, which is thematically parallel to it. That a set of 10 verbal parallels, balanced 5 and 5, so 5 on each side, links 11:35 to 36 to 12:6 to 7. That verse 35 does not represent a different period of history from the rest of verses 29 to 35. That verse 36 does not occur in a different period of history from the rest of verses 36 to 39. They just represent their section. They didn't, to formulate these parallels, they didn't re-quote the whole middle section of Daniel 11. There were some representative samples. H, that the parallels between 11:35 to 36 and 12:6 to 7 apply equally to all of verses 29 to 35 and 36 to 39. That 7:25d and 12:7 both describe the same prophetic period, the time, times, and half a time, or 1260 days or years. That the appointed time of 11:35 marks the end of the 1260 days. That until the time of the end looks from verse 35 to the time of the end in verse 40. That the time of the end begins at a specific moment of history, and that the time, times, and half a time, and the time of the end adjoin each other chronologically. There is no space between them. And I don't know if I have. I'm going to come to a slide that looks at that later. Okay. The point. Oh, sure. That? And did you get the first one? Thank you, yes. This? Okay. Okay. So here we have the material that I've been trying to present. So we have actually four parallels with Daniel 7, 25a, b, c, and d. Then we have parallels internal to Daniel 11, 29 and 35, 35 and 40. And we have the time, times, and half a time in 12, 6, and 7 in Daniel 12. And we have one more. And that last line is one that I will not try to defend here. I'm just going to throw it out, and I'm saying this is where we're headed. That's what we're looking at. Daniel 11:29-39 is surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. From chapter 7, from chapter 12, from the end of chapter 12. Now, there's one thing we have to note here, and that is that 1290 is not 1260. So we have two parallels of 1260, and we have an exquisitely detailed, just consummately beautiful set of parallels linking 1132-35 and 12, 10 and 11. We can't discuss those here, but this is where we're headed. And so it's the overarching unity of these things that I wanted to point out. Okay, so let me say just a word about history, and I'll go quickly here. Nick Miller discusses the events of 1798 from a legal rather than military point of view. You know, I just feel like we need to just say one more word about this. What I've been saying through all of this is that there is an ending point in verse 39. It leads us, but this whole middle section leads us to an ending point. And what follows that ending point is the time of the end. History is going like this, and you only need to cut it once. So there's what's before that dividing line, and there's what's after that dividing line. So there's the appointed time, there's 1260 days, 1260 years, and then immediately after that, going this way, is the time of the end. Okay, now, history. What happened at that moment of history? Nick Miller discusses the events of 1798 from a legal rather than military point of view, with special reference to the Justinian Code, key term, the Justinian Code. He notes that as regards the papacy, the religiously oriented Code of Justinian was made officially null and void in the city of Rome on February 15, 1798. This happened when General Berthier declared Rome an independent republic, and in consequence, every other temporal authority emanating from the old government of the Pope is suppressed, and it shall no longer exercise any function. That was February 15. This pronouncement, made as part of Berthier's Bill number 8, has no relation to any corresponding events in Paris that would promulgate the new Napoleonic Code more widely. When you look this up in Wikipedia, the date you find for the Napoleonic Code is 1804. 1804 is not 1798. But what they did in Paris concerned Parisians. What they did in Rome concerned the Pope, and the Pope is the one this prophecy is about. The same code had been made binding for the papacy by Belisarius in Rome in March of AD 538. And when you look that one up, you'll find the date, 536 or so. Belisarius could not have implemented this code in 538 in the absence of an army, nor could Berthier have abolished it in 1798 in the absence of an army. Multiple factors are involved at both ends of the 1260 years. But these are not the only factors. There are other factors besides these. Engel Yoder has done some interesting research on the Third Council of Orleans, which convened sometime during 538. Canon 28 of this council forbade ordinary field labor on Sunday. This canon is interesting because it is a Sunday law, but also because of the way violators were to be punished. So here's a quotation from that canon. If anyone be found doing the works forbidden above, let him be punished not as the civil authorities may direct, but as the ecclesiastical powers may determine. Boy, that reverberates. That statement reverberates through the whole Middle Ages. When the church was causing people, I mean, they sent them to the state for execution, but when the church was causing people to be physically executed and undergo exquisite torments, so this is a starting point. The above canon should be seen as a practical application of the more general grant of authority made available to the papacy by Belisarius in the early spring of that same year. So the code was made effective, and then at the Council of Orleans, it was implemented more widely. Okay, conclusion. So we've been talking about verses 29 and 35, about verses 35 and 40, and you'll notice that 35 stays the same in both cases. There are no dates in verses 36 to 39, and why aren't there? Because there are no events in 36 to 39. Nothing happens then. The king expresses himself, there are attitudes, there are wishes and proud thoughts and so on. But 36 to 39 contains no events. The events are in 29 to 35. Ironically, a point I wanted to draw from this was that in verse 35, where it says end of the 1260 years, and verse 40 says beginning of the time of the end, those are one and the same thing. When verse 35 says appointed time, that's the last moment before the time of the end begins. And the time of the end, until the time of the end, so there's this period of anticipation. And then the time of the end finally comes. But it's, the one is the same as the other. The captivity of Pope Pius VI in Rome in 1798 could just as easily be described as the end of the 1260 years, as in fact the text does describe it as the beginning of the time of the end. It's the same. So there's a period of power, and there's a period of woundedness that follows that period of power. Verse 29 is a starting point. Verse 39 is an ending point, and simultaneously a starting point. Now here's the little graphic I was thinking about. History is doing this, and you just slice it once. The event that brings the 1260 years to an end is the same as the event that initiates the time of the end. What the time of the end is the end of is the 1260 years of papal dominance. If so, we know from history what brought that period to an end. It was an overwhelming attack by the King of the South. The King of the South in verse 40a is not a world religion. I'm drawing this now from history, not from the text. I'm drawing it from history. When we see the events that actually occurred 200 and more years ago, we can tell from history it's a fulfilled prophecy that the active party was Berthier as ordered by Napoleon, and the events are what we know them to be. The King of the South in verse 40a is therefore not a world religion, but a secular power, one whose secularity is so intense that it borders on atheism. These are exegetical points. Now, Lee makes clear from the start that since the primary purpose of my translation, that is his translation, of Daniel 11 relates to the identity of the participants, that purpose was the guiding principle in the translation. That is, other matters such as vocabulary, syntax, discourse segmentation, and chronological sequence were not directly addressed. All of the things that we've been talking about here, he does not address them. And that's what he says he will do up front, so that's good. But until they have been addressed, we will not know whether our anaphoric references are to a Greek or a Roman. If we don't know what empire we are dealing with, it will be difficult to know our focus, to narrow our focus to an entity or an individual. There must be some prior level of analysis. We must first be clear on where the points of transition are between one empire and another.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hardy. I was just jotting down areas of agreement and disagreement with some of the other positions as I've been hearing them today. And I'm actually surprised at how much more agreement there is than disagreement when we look at some key essential factors here. I was, as with all the presentations we've heard today, and I'm sure with tomorrow, each one is deeply convicting. And so let's open it up for questions here. This was a very detailed linguistic analysis, and I think we really value the insights you bring to seeing how the structure of the text relates to it, relates to the wider verses, and particularly the idea of until and at the time of the end, from verse 35 to 39, how that really ties us down to a punctiliar point in history rather than the preposition be, mean during the time of the end, as some would say. So, questions or comments, because this was an excellent presentation, and it really kind of forces us to think very critically about what we've heard so far today. So any comments or questions? Yes, brother here. Okay, make sure he has the microphone. Thank you.
Hey, Frank. Thank you for your presentation.
Hermano.
Remembering old times together.
Yes, sir.
I wonder why you use paid attention in 30B instead of had intelligence.
I'm sorry, say again?
I wonder, in 30B, your translation is paid attention.
Pay attention, yes.
Instead of having or had intelligence.
Okay, well, the word is yavein, so that means to pay attention. And in context, you could say have intelligence with. Yeah, that's good.
Another thing is, it seems to me it's a paradox that we use atheism, but in my opinion, atheism doesn't exist. Atheism is spiritualism. If you go to Egypt, they were not atheists, they were gods.
Yeah.
They believed in all gods. They had so many gods.
Yeah.
And if you go to Cuba, those who say they are communistic, atheists, they believe in spiritualism.
Yeah.
They are a spiritualist. And it is interesting that the president of Cuba was asking the African gurus to pray for them.
Interesting.
So, atheism, you know, in Egypt, the Pharaoh was a god himself, and they believe in all kinds of God. The plagues were hitting all the gods of them.
Yeah.
So, seems to me it's a paradox.
Okay. You raised a very interesting point. You were going to say?
If I could just say in response to that, that if we take the word atheism, atheos, it is true that Egypt was a polytheistic society, but who is Jehovah that I should know him? Who is Yahweh? I do not know him. Egypt was a Yahweh-rejecting society. And, communism today is also ultimately a rejection of Jesus Christ. You read Marx's writings and other Marxist writings, it's a rejection of the person of Jesus Christ. And every society has its gods that it worships one way or another. And so I think that when we say atheism, it may be more accurate to say a rejection of the lordship of Jesus Christ, which is what Pharaoh did. That would also, that definition would also include Islam as well. So both atheism and Islam, let's say the French Revolution and Islam, would be considered under the rejection of the lordship of Jesus Christ.
Excellent question and excellent response. We're going to make you an honorary member of the Atheism Caucus. That caucus may have been unfortunately named. I always have to think twice when I say it myself. But yes, the word atheism, first of all, is perhaps too broad a term. I personally think in terms of a strongly typed category, the king of the north, and an everything else category, kind of like the mathematical concept of a complement. So there's X and there's the complement of X. So you have belief and unbelief in the true God. You were going to say more.
Okay, Brother Davidson.
Yes, Dr. Hardy. I'm wondering in your parallels if you noticed any between the how long in Daniel 8:13 and the how long in Daniel 12:6. The scenes painted in both instances were 4 heavenly beings, a body of water, and a question. And the same occurred in both instances. And I'm wondering if you saw any parallels in that we could use to enhance our understanding.
Great connection. Yeah, good catch.
I've wrestled with that same question, brother, that you just asking. And I look at, there's 2 questions. When you look at Daniel 8:13, there's 2 questions that are asked. How long is the host going to be trampled? And how long will the sanctuary be defiled? And we only get an answer to one of those in Daniel 8:14. It's the how long is the sanctuary? When will it be restored? And Daniel 10:14 tells us what the purpose of the whole chapter 11 is how long, what will become of God's people. So I see we have an answer to the question that's asked in Daniel 8:13, that it's 2,300 days and then the sanctuary is restored. And I see chapter 11 as Gabriel returning to give the answer, how long are God's people going to be suffering and afflicted in the world? So I definitely see a connection that you're talking about there. And Daniel 8's the answer to one question, and Daniel 11's the answer to the other. I'm sorry.
Great.
All right, thank you very much. Brother Engel, and then Dr. Tarsi has his hand up. Then we'll come through to Lee Van Asperen here.
Yeah, regarding the atheism, even the French Revolution had their goddess of reason.
Yeah.
And so, but you're saying that the atheism view is the king of the south is not atheism, but a political power that denies the existence of God. And
that's the way I would put it.
And you would identify that power as revolutionary France. I think it's called the First French Republic.
Right.
So, and then, and I think, I'm in that camp too myself. But in verse 35, talks about the appointed time. And just for clarification, you're saying that appointed time is 1798 in your view, that equates with the time of the end in verse 40. They're talking about the same point, cut off that appointed time. So the appointed time in verse 36 is pointing forward to verse 40, or are verses 36 to 39 a recap of the same time frame of the preceding verses, 30 to 35?
Yeah,
or
like
is it chronological straight through?
Like a sandwich around 36 to 39. So 35 points forward to 40, just leaps over those intervening verses. You remember we had a slide earlier where 4 lines were drawn across the screen, and I was saying all 4 of these describe the same period of time. Whether you describe it from Daniel 7 or you describe it from Daniel 11, it's all the same. The king does not wait until the end of a certain number of years to go by before he switches from violent actions to proud words. He's constantly spewing out a stream of proud words, and he's constantly doing violent actions.
So it's simultaneous, the actions and the words.
Yeah.
And so it's just describing the same period of time from 2 perspectives.
That's the way I would see it. And ironically, a lot of secular commentators pick up on this. For them, the villain figure in verse 36, the king, Hamelech, is Antiochus, but they say, well, this is an overview of his evil activity.
And if I can ask one more question about the appointed time in verse 29, where do you put that in the history?
In history?
Or, yeah, if you have a date for that.
Yeah, whatever the date was for the Third Council of Orleans.
Oh, okay.
All right, Dr. Tarsi Lee, and just as a plug for everybody, my grandmother was, her maiden name was Graves, and her cousin was the war poet called Robert Graves from World War I. Maybe some of you know him. He wrote a book called I, Claudius, and Claudius the God. He also wrote one of the best histories on Belisarius. And you can go and find it on Amazon by Robert Graves. It's on Count Belisarius, and he goes into great detail on the historicity of what we've been covering in this chapter here. I don't earn any royalties from that, but it is a plug from a family member. Okay, Dr. Tarsi Lee, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your paper. Both your papers have been very helpful, enlightening. So I just want to mention a couple things. Number one, as we corresponded by email, and I mentioned that the syntax, the function of shuv was, I used the word perhaps in a paper, and so I think you made a good argument for reading all of them in Daniel 11 as adverbial, and so I'll accept that, and
wow.
I will go with that. So that's my first.
Can you just say that again, Dr. Lee?
Yeah, I'll accept what Dr. Hardy said. I think on the syntax, I think it was, it makes sense. You know,
Okay,
I'm not sure that it applies everywhere in the Bible, but I think you made a good point that all of them in Daniel 11 are probably better seen as adverbial.
Yeah, now
that's
verse
one point.
10 is a little bit more tricky because there you have the Carré readings bumping up against the Katives. And
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so,
sure.
but yeah.
Yeah. The second point is that I never meant to say that, you know, understanding the anaphora was sufficient to interpret the entire chapter. So,
Sure.
of course, we need other things. We need to look at history. We need to look at
Sure.
where the text should be segmented and so on. And I think you did a very good job of that. I just don't think that there's any contradiction between them. The anaphora will still work the same way, and we still need to segment the text and so on.
Yeah.
Could I ask Dr. Lee a question? Very specifically, when Dr. Hardy was talking about verse 35, where it's until the appointed time, and then in verse 40, it's at the time of the end, the idea that the until leading the verb, the word until, and then the word at, that really nails down verse 40 as a punctiliar point in time, rather than, you know, like, I'm going to be with you at 6 o'clock, rather than during the 6 o'clock hour. Do you have the same understanding of the way the Hebrew works?
I'm not sure. I mean, we are dealing with, well, first of all, you know, in terms of the preposition in verse 40, debate, we're dealing with late biblical Hebrew, and there are some unusual things that happen in late biblical Hebrew.
Okay.
If it were pre-exilic Hebrew, then I would make a distinction between using the preposition kaf or the preposition beit, where the kaf is more punctiliar and the beit is not. But it's a late area where, you know, the beit could, of course, mean the same thing as the kaf. So I mean, I hear that you're making a point. I'm not sure that the argument makes a difference in the interpretation in the end. I think that the connection between until the time of the end and in or at the time of the end, I think the connection is very clear, very clear. But until the time of the end, is that referring to a time period, or is that referring to a point in time?
Ooh,
I don't know if that really affects how we interpret the fulfillment. So that, you know.
Okay.
So I'm straddling the fence on that, but I'm not sure that it makes a difference in the interpretation.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we can study that further.
We have a Hebrew commentary over here, Brother Wall. Is it Dr. Wall, by the way? No, you're getting there, though. All right, Brother Wall.
Yes. I'm commenting on the syntax of verse 29. Lemoed Yashuv Uva Banagev. Okay, so there is I've seen that like the Yashuv and Ba has been put together to be translated as come again.
Yes.
Rather, it's divided by a conjunction there, which means he would return and enters the south, because there's a conjunction there rather than the two being put together, Yashuv and Ba together.
Okay, that's a good point. That would be something to study out. I started to do that with the book of Genesis. I looked through, reverse translating. So I looked up all the places where ESV said again and looked to see how they said it or what they were translating from. And, we would need to do something like that through a wider corpus.
Right. Okay, sure.
All right, thank you very much. Brother Lee here.
Really appreciated your presentation and also Dr. Lee's today. Very insightful.
Oh,
yes. As I understood your presentation, you're connecting Daniel 8, 9, and 11 and 12 all as the same event.
Well, it's 7. 7:25 and Daniel 11:29 to 39.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Yeah. In your study, have you at all considered the times, and half a time that you referred to in your presentation, also correlating with the same period of time of Revelation 11 and also 12?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Amen.
Absolutely. This period of time is mentioned 7 times in Scripture. 7 times. And we need to connect all the dots. Absolutely. Thank you so much for raising that point.
Could I ask then for clarification then?
Oh, okay.
If Revelation 11, verse 2 and 3 are referring to 3.5 year periods of time that are sequentially listed, but they are written grammatically different in their explanation. It's not written the same. The context of the way the author wrote it. There's 2 separate periods of time. What is the covenant then that is talked about in relationship to time, in relationship to Daniel 9, verse 27?
I'm starting to lose that, and I was a little bit distracted. If I could, please let me bring this up. Now, you're saying Revelation 11.
The two witnesses.
Yeah.
The Old and New Testament.
Okay, so here we have...
If Daniel 11 applies to the same period of time as Revelation 11 applies to the same period of time that you're speaking of in Daniel, then if there's 2 periods of time there that are talked about that equal a total of 1 week, Daniel 9 also talks about a 1-week period of time as a covenant in Daniel 9:27. Is that also the same period of time?
I would say no. 3.5 days. Just a moment. For 3.5 days, some of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze on their dead bodies. I have always understood that as the earlier part and the later part of the French Revolution. Now,
could we apply this with a dual application to apply at the end of time to God's people?
I would feel very uncomfortable getting into dual applications of apocalyptic prophecy. I just wouldn't want to go there.
All right, thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left. Does anybody want a final comment on what you've heard from Dr. Hardy? And okay, Dr. Gain.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you. Wonderful applications. You've got the violence and the pride and the chiasm and then the moed to the moed cates and then bracketing and all of that. That's wonderful. When I look at Daniel 11, verse 35, it's referring to, it seems like the point there is that there's going to be relief for these people from the dominance of the papacy. This is a period of papal domination. I think you agreed it's the 1260 years, right? It's during the 1260 years. This is the medieval papacy and so on. And so they're going to have relief at the time of the end. That's what I get out of this, which makes perfect sense. Then when we come down to 40, I agree. It's a point in time when, at the beginning of that time, they gain relief. But although Beit Cates begins a period of time, it doesn't all have to happen right at that moment.
Oh, certainly.
Just like, for example, we have Ad Erev Boker Alpayim V'Shlosh in Daniel 8:14 until Ad, same preposition, right? Until, same preposition as in verse 35 of chapter 11, until 2,300 days, V'nitzdak Kodesh, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Well, we all know that's a process. Yes, it points to a time, 1844, but that begins a process.
Right. A point of inception.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm seeing. But I'm seeing that that doesn't necessitate the idea that the king of the south going against the king of the north and all these events have to be in 1798. The time of the end begins 1798, yes, but beginning in that time, sometime, these things are going to occur.
Right.
And I'm remembering what Ellen White says, where she said a number of times, beginning in 1883, going through 1909, Jesus could have come ere this. And so I wonder, how could all this have been fulfilled ere this, before 1883, and so on and so forth. Now, communist Russia wasn't there. Communist China wasn't there.
Right.
Islam was. And as I think Conrad Vine pointed out well, that in terms of the approach to Jesus Christ, there is a similarity there. There's a parallel there. The other thing, and I'll mention this tomorrow, we don't have to get into it, is V'yitnegach is a hitpa'el. Not only that, not just a hitpa'el, which is often reciprocal, but it is followed by the preposition im, that means with him, rather than the peel, as in chapter 8 and other places where it means a unilateral goring knockout punch. This is not that. It means to initiate hostilities with, to provoke, lock horns with. Tarsi Lee's translation gets it well, and that agrees with DCH, Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, that it's initiating conflict, and then right away the king of the north attacks and all these other things. So I agree with Kim Kier where he says that verses 40 to 45 are not yet fulfilled. And I think that's what Ellen White meant in 9 Testimonies, where she says that almost all of the prophecy is fulfilled. And it's verses 40 and following. We got the time of the end, but all this other stuff is really a conveyor belt. It happens very rapidly. Final movements are rapid ones. And when we see this rushing of the king of the north on the king of the south, this provocation, and we see these countries that are being overflowed and passed through, then we're going to know, wow, this is really going to happen very fast. And the next thing is going to be the persecution down there in verse 44. He'll go out with great fury to destroy many because of the tidings from the east and the north, which seems to refer to perhaps the tidings of the second coming. I mean, we can talk about that. But this is pretty exciting stuff, that we're this close to the end. And when we're in verse 40 and we see a lot of things coming together in the world, however you interpret this, we see a lot of things coming together, and it's almost like a mousetrap. It could just snap like that, and all these things could happen rapidly. So we need to be ready.
Yeah, no, that's a good take home. I think we can be a little more specific in regard to what happens inside this period of time. I think we can divide 40 to 43 from 44 and 45. And the way you can know when you pass from the one to the other is by asking one question. How angry is the king? How mad is the king? If the king is not mad yet, you're not in verse 44 yet. So, and there's a symbolic, well, I know some don't like the word symbolism here, but there's a matter of the imagery, because if we were doing this on a map, the king of the north is coming, well, out of the north, and he's going like this. And the reason why I do this instead of this is because he's following the coastline of Egypt. And when he gets there, he goes all the way down out the other end at the second cataract. I spoke on this on a previous occasion. But then he comes back. So in 40 to 43, you have this. And in 44 and 45, you have this. So he's retracing his steps, and this time he's mad. Now we have persecution. But 40 to 43, I wouldn't have any trouble believing that a lot of that has been fulfilled already. My opinion.
All right, so our last comment from Brother Lee, and then we will wrap up today.
Did someone else have something first? I don't want to dominate the questions here.
Oh, I see Elder Rosenberg. Is your hand up or are you stretching, brother? Somebody once asked my father in class, why are you yawning? And he said, I wasn't yawning, sir. It was an involuntary rictus of pleasure. So, okay, Brother Lee.
So, Dr. Hardy, I guess a follow-up question after hearing your statement and sitting here thinking about it. In the context of all of the events of Daniel that we described also parallel the same events in Revelation 11 and 12. If we only were to look at the events of Daniel described as historical, how would we then apply Revelation 11 and 12 as historical instead of literal at an event in the future? Because if we're going to apply it congruently, it would need to apply congruently through the text of Daniel and also to Revelation. And I don't know how we'd apply Revelation in a historical application.
Okay. Good question. Okay. So we were in chapter 11. You know, I have this in the table a lot of places, but I'm spacing right now. In chapter 11, where do we find the last 5 instances of the time times and half a time, 42 months, 1,260 days? One is in chapter 12, one is in chapter 14, a couple of them I thought in chapter 11. Yeah, 13, okay, so 12, 13, 14. I would want to compare the wording. And this is something we could study out more. I don't see this as an 8th and 9th repetition of the time period. I would see it as a faint reflection of, it's a miniature version of, played out.
The only reason that I bring it to everyone's attention here is that we've always looked at this from a historical perspective. But if we read Matthew 24, and Jesus is saying that this is an event that takes place at the end of time, referring to Daniel, and an abomination of desolation that takes place at the end of time, then how would we apply that as a historical event if Jesus is saying that it has to happen just before the second coming? And so as we look at the book of Daniel, we do see a complete historical application that was there. But if we use the interpretation of what Jesus is asking to the disciples at the end of time, that this is an event that takes place that precedes the second coming, then Daniel, the prophecies of Daniel have to be applied again to a later period of time at the end of world history. And that's my question I'm posing to all of you.
Yeah. My response to that would be we need to open our Bibles. We're not going to nail it down here. And we can go back and forth with questions and responses. But we need to open our Bibles and notice exactly what the wording is in this passage and exactly what it is in that passage. Compare the passages and the context and so on, and nail this down because, you know, just here in this venue.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. I think it's been a wonderful afternoon, yes? Yes, we had Pastor Kim Kerr, then Dr. Frank Hardy, and they've done an incredible job putting together some thought-provoking, stimulating, and really challenging presentations. And every time we approach this chapter 11 from a slightly different angle, it's amazing how much light shines through to us. And so we'd like to thank Dr. Hardy for an incredible presentation just now. And I know that we've all been blessed through our discussions today. For those of you watching online, or for those of you here, you can download the papers. They're all on Daniel11prophecy.org. And you can download, or .com, you can download those for yourselves. Take the time to read them slowly and just reflect on what's included in those, because they're up there so that the whole church can be blessed and can grow in knowledge and understanding. So let's close out our day with a word of prayer, and then we will see you tomorrow. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for the gift of wisdom and understanding and discernment that you've blessed us with today. Father, thank you for the gifts that you give your church. Thank you, Father, for the speakers and the materials they've presented. Thank you, Father, for open hearts and minds willing to think in new patterns of thinking, and hearts that are willing to be filled with your Spirit and ultimately to be ready for your second coming. So, Lord, dismiss us now with your blessing. May your angels watch over us. May your Spirit walk with us and go before us. And may the love of Jesus be seen and heard in all that we say and do. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. So we will gather back here tomorrow at 8 a.m. for our morning prayer time. And the formal presentations will begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. They'll be streamed online. We'll have Dr. Roy Gaines speaking tomorrow from the Islamic perspective. And then we have Pastor Tim Rosenberg presenting a really fascinating paper on how the Islam and the atheism views are actually very, very similar, and you can actually have almost a joint understanding of these passages. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and may God bless you all. It's 8:30? Yours is at 8:30? All right, okay. All right, so don't miss it, folks. It's 8:30 Eastern, Dr. Gaines' presentation. Don't roll in at 9 o'clock. We need you here by 8 o'clock for the prayer and 8:30 for his presentation. I'm sorry, Dr. Gaines. We just cut out half your audience there. My apologies. So 8:30, everybody. 8 o'clock at worship here, yes, and then you'll be here for 8:30. The question about at or during or in will be resolved tomorrow by whether you're here at 8 o'clock or 8:30.